My wife told everyone at her sister's 40th birthday party that I was the reason our marriage failed, and she said it with a wine glass in her hand and a sad little smile on her face, the smile of a woman who has rehearsed being brave in front of a mirror, and 31 people nodded along with her. Because why wouldn't they? Because I wasn't there to say otherwise. Because I was standing in the kitchen doorway with a tray of deviled eggs I'd carried in from my car like an idiot, having shown up 20 minutes early the way I always do, and I heard every word of it before anyone saw me. She told them I stopped trying. She told them I worked too much and touched her too little, and that somewhere around our 10th anniversary I simply checked out of the marriage the way a man checks out of a hotel room, quietly, efficiently, without looking back at what he was leaving behind. She told them she tried everything to save us. She told them she cried herself to sleep for a year before she finally accepted that some men just stop loving you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And every single person in that living room looked at her with the particular tenderness reserved for a woman who has survived something, and not one of them knew, because she had made sure not one of them would ever know, that 6 weeks before that party I had sat in my home office with her phone mirrored onto my laptop screen, watching 14 months of text messages load one at a time, watching my wife tell another man "Good morning, beautiful," in the exact same words she used to text me the first year we were together, watching dates and hotel names, and a nickname I didn't recognize scroll past in blue and grey bubbles until 4 in the morning, until I understood with a kind of terrible clarity that the story she was about to start telling everyone was going to be the opposite of the truth, and that if I didn't do something about it, calmly, patiently, and with proof, I was going to spend the rest of my life being the villain in a story I never wrote a single line of. My name is Gregory Calloway. Everyone except my mother calls me Greg. I'm 42 years old. I live in Ashford Falls, Pennsylvania, a town of about 18,000 people, built around a river that used to run a paper mill, and now mostly just runs kayaks in the summer, and reflects a lot of church steeples in the winter, and until 14 months ago I would have told you, without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt, that my marriage was the steadiest thing I had ever built in a life that has not always been steady. I want to tell you what my wife did, and what I found on her phone that proved she was lying to an entire room full of people who loved her, and I want to tell you what I did about it, because I think there is a version of this story where a man finds out the truth and simply crumbles, and there is another version where he finds out the truth and gets very, very quiet and starts writing everything down. I'm telling you the second version, because it is the one that actually happened, and because I think there are men and women out there right now sitting in their own kitchen doorways, holding their own trays of something, hearing someone they love rewrite history in real time, who need to know it is possible to survive that moment without losing yourself in it. But you have to understand who we were before any of this, because the marriage this story is about was not a bad one for a long time, and I refuse to let anyone, including the woman who was my wife for 11 years, tell it any other way. I met Vanessa Reyes on a Tuesday in October, 13 years ago, at a continuing education seminar in Harrisburg that neither of us wanted to be at. I was 29, working as a logistics manager for a regional freight company, sent there by my boss to get recertified on some compliance software nobody in the room actually cared about. Vanessa was 31, a physical therapist from Ashford Falls, sent there by her practice for the exact same tedious reason, and we ended up at the same folding table during the lunch break because it was the only one with 2 open seats left, and she looked at the sad turkey wrap on her paper plate and said, out loud, to no one in particular, I became a healthcare professional for this, and I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee, and that was it. That was the whole beginning, 6 words about a turkey wrap. We talked through the entire afternoon session instead of listening to a woman explain database migration protocols, passing notes back and forth on the backs of our handout packets like we were 15 years old. And by the time the seminar ended, I had her phone number and she had mine, and I drove the 90 minutes back to Ashford Falls with the radio off, just replaying the conversation, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, which was the specific, unmistakable sensation of your life quietly turning a corner without asking your permission first. We dated for 2 years before I proposed, which people at the time told me was slow, but I've never regretted a single month of it, because I wanted to know her, actually know her, not just the version of her that shows up early in a relationship wearing its best clothes. I learned that she cried at dog food commercials, but not at actual sad movies. I learned that she called her mother every single Sunday at exactly 4 o'clock and would not be moved from that ritual for anything short of a hospital visit. I learned that she had a temper that came on fast and burned out even faster, unlike mine, which took longer to light and then sat there smouldering for days if I let it, and we used to joke that between the two of us we made one reasonably well-adjusted person. I proposed on the pedestrian bridge over the river downtown, the one with all the padlocks other couples had clipped to the railing over the years, on a Friday evening in April with the whole town lit up gold behind her, and she said yes before I even finished the sentence, which I have never let her forget, and for a long time that story was the one we told at every dinner party, at every family gathering, the story of the woman who said yes too fast because she already knew. We got married the following June in her parents' backyard, under a rented tent that nearly blew away in an afternoon thunderstorm that everyone now remembers as the best part of the wedding, and Father Alvarez, who had known Vanessa since her first communion, gave a homily about patience that I did not appreciate nearly enough at the time, and think about constantly now. My best man was Tom Ferris, my friend since college, who gave a toast so embarrassing that Vanessa's grandmother covered her ears, and Vanessa's maid of honour was her younger sister Camille. And standing near the back of the tent, clapping along with everyone else, was Vanessa's closest friend since high school, a woman named Priya Nandi, who I want you to remember, because she becomes important later, and not in a good way. For the first several years of our marriage, I would put us up against any couple I knew. We bought a modest brick colonial on Larkspur Lane, 3 bedrooms, a crooked backyard fence I kept meaning to fix, and we filled it, in time, with 2 children. Our daughter Emily came first 7 years ago, red-faced and furious at the world from the very first second, and our son Caleb followed 3 years after that, easygoing in a way that used to make Vanessa joke that we'd used up all our difficult baby luck on his sister. I worked my way up from logistics manager to regional operations director at the same freight company, which meant more money and more hours, a trade I don't think either of us fully reckoned with the cost of until it was already being paid. Vanessa built her physical therapy practice into something respected in the county. 3 other therapists working under her by the time our son started kindergarten, and on paper, on every single piece of paper that mattered, we were the couple other people pointed to when they wanted to believe it was possible to build something that lasted. I want to be honest about the cracks, because I think the version of this story where everything was perfect until one specific betrayal is a lie, even if the ending is still true. Around year 8, we went through what I can only describe as a long grey stretch. Nothing dramatic, no single fight anyone could point to. Just 2 people so consumed with children and mortgages, and Vanessa's expanding practice and my growing territory at work that we started passing each other in the hallway of our own house, like co-workers on a shift change. A kiss on the cheek instead of the mouth. A conversation about the school pickup schedule instead of a conversation about anything either of us actually felt. I noticed it. I want to say clearly, on the record, in my own voice, that I noticed it, and I did not do nothing about it. In year 9, I cut back my travel. I started coaching Caleb's T-ball team on Saturday mornings instead of catching up on emails. I planned a trip to the Outer Banks, just the 2 of us, Vanessa's mother taking the kids for a week, and it was, by both our accounts at the time, one of the best weeks of our marriage, the kind of week where you remember why you picked this particular person out of everyone else in the world. I am telling you this not to make myself sound like a saint, because I wasn't one. I worked too much for years, and I know it. But because I need you to understand that the story Vanessa told that room full of people, the story where I simply stopped trying somewhere around our 10th anniversary and never looked back, is not a story about a real, breathing marriage with real, breathing effort in it. It is a story with the effort edited out, because the effort was inconvenient to the story she needed to tell. The change, when I look back on it now with the particular clarity that only comes after you already know the ending, started small enough that I genuinely believed it was a good thing for a long time. 14 months ago, Vanessa announced at dinner one night that she was joining a fitness studio that had opened up in the old feed store building downtown, a place called Iron Line Performance, run by a man named Derek Holloway, who had apparently built a small following among the local moms for his 6-week transformation programs. I remember being happy about it, genuinely happy. Vanessa had put her own body somewhere at the bottom of a very long list of priorities for years, behind the kids, behind the practice, behind me, and I thought, good, she deserves something that's just for her. I even offered to take the kids on Tuesday and Thursday evenings so she could go to the 6 o'clock class without rushing. And I want you to sit with that detail for a moment because it will matter later. I was the one who cleared the schedule that made the whole thing possible. I was, in the most literal sense, the person who handed my wife the time she needed to have an affair, because I loved her and wanted her to have something for herself, and there is a particular flavour of bitterness in that fact that I have had to learn to live with. For the first 2 or 3 months, nothing about it seemed different from any other hobby Vanessa had picked up over the years. She came home sweaty and tired and a little proud of herself, showed me pictures of a deadlift personal record on her phone, complained good-naturedly about a workout called Fran that apparently exists specifically to humble people, and I was glad, uncomplicated, boring gladness, the kind you don't examine because there's nothing underneath it to examine. Somewhere around month 4 the changes started, and I want to walk through them the way I actually experienced them at the time, which is to say, not as a pattern, but as a series of disconnected, forgettable moments that only assembled themselves into a shape much later. She started doing her hair before the 6 o'clock class. Not a ponytail thrown up in the car, which is what she'd done the first few months, but an actual blowout some mornings, done at home before work so it would still look good 12 hours later at the gym. She mentioned Derek's name more, not suspiciously, just conversationally, the way you mention any instructor you see 3 times a week. Derek says my form on the hip hinge is finally clicking. Derek's doing a nutrition seminar next month. Derek thinks I could compete in the Masters division if I wanted to, and I nodded along every time, because why wouldn't a fitness instructor talk to his client about her form and her nutrition and her potential? That is, after all, the job. She started going to a 7 a.m, class on Saturdays too, in addition to the 2 weeknight sessions, and when I offered, easily, without any suspicion at all, to come watch or even join her for that one since I didn't have anywhere to be, she told me the Saturday class was full, a beginner cohort thing, and I believed her. Because why would I not believe her? Because 11 years of marriage do not evaporate into suspicion over a scheduling detail. I want to tell you about the phone, because the phone is where this story actually begins, even though I did not know it at the time. Vanessa had always been a person who left her phone face up on the kitchen counter, screen unlocked half the time, texts visible to anyone who walked past, and somewhere around month 5 of Iron Line performance, without any announcement, without any conversation about it, she started carrying it into the bathroom when she showered, keeping it face down on her nightstand instead of the counter, and setting a passcode on a phone that had never had one in 11 years of marriage. I noticed the exact week it happened, because I picked it up off the counter one evening to check the weather for a trip I was planning, and found myself staring at a lock screen I did not recognise, and when I asked her about it, lightly, the way you ask about something you assume has an obvious, boring explanation, she said, "Oh, work stuff. Patient records, HIPAA, you know how it is." And I did know how it is. Physical therapists do have to be careful with patient information, and so I let it go, filed it under reasonable, and did not think about it again for weeks. That is the part I need people to understand about how an affair actually gets away with itself in a real marriage. It is not one enormous red flag waving in a stadium. It is 40 small, individually reasonable explanations, each one perfectly plausible on its own, that only become a pattern when you finally have a reason to lay them all out on a table at the same time and look at them together. HIPAA explains the passcode, a full beginner class explains the Saturday session, a new hobby explains the blowouts, getting more confident in her own skin explains why she started buying clothes that fit a body she was proud of again. Every single individual thread was innocent. It was only the whole cloth, much later, that told a different story. By month 7, Vanessa had lost 18 pounds, and she looked, by any objective measure, fantastic, and I told her so, often, because I meant it, because I was proud of her, because some small foolish part of me thought this was simply what our marriage looked like at year 11. A woman rediscovering herself and a husband cheering her on from the sidelines like he was supposed to. She started sleeping in workout clothes some nights, so she could roll straight into the 6 a.m. session without waking me by getting dressed. She started keeping protein bars in a drawer in her home office that she'd started locking, which she explained as keeping the kids from raiding her stash. A completely reasonable explanation for 2 children who once ate an entire tub of frosting with a serving spoon while I was in the next room. Every explanation fit. That is the horror of it, looking back. Every single explanation fit perfectly, right up until the moment none of them did. My friend Tom Ferris was the first person to say anything out loud, and I resented him for it at the time, which I have since apologised for more than once. Tom and I have known each other since we were freshman roommates at Penn State, and he had watched my marriage from close enough range over the years to have earned the right to say hard things to me, even when I did not want to hear them. We were at his place in October, watching a football game neither of us cared much about the outcome of, and out of nowhere, during a commercial break, he asked me how things were going with Vanessa and the gym thing, and I said, "Fine. Great, actually. She looks amazing." And Tom was quiet for a second in a way that made me look over at him, and he said, "Greg, my cousin Danielle goes to that same gym, the 6 o'clock class, and she mentioned something to my wife a few weeks back that I probably shouldn't repeat, but I think I should anyway because I'd want someone to tell me." I asked him what it was, and he told me that Danielle had said in passing, not maliciously, just as an observation between acquaintances, that Vanessa and the instructor Derek seemed unusually close, always the last two to leave, always laughing at something private, and that Danielle had assumed for a while they were old friends from before the gym until someone mentioned they'd only met when the studio opened. I remember exactly how I felt hearing that, sitting on Tom's couch with a beer going warm in my hand, and what I felt was not suspicion. What I felt was mild embarrassment on Vanessa's behalf, and a flicker of defensive irritation at Tom for repeating gossip from a cousin I'd met twice. I told him that Vanessa was a naturally warm, talkative person, that she'd probably become friendly with her instructor the same way she became friendly with the mailman and the guy who cuts our grass and half the waitstaff at every restaurant we'd ever been regulars at, because that is simply who my wife is, a person incapable of small talk that stays small. Tom held up both hands and said, "I hope that's all it is, man. I really do. I just wanted you to hear it from me instead of hearing it secondhand later and wondering why nobody said anything." I thanked him, and I meant it, but I drove home that night turning the conversation over in my head in a way I hadn't turned anything over in a long time. And when I got home, Vanessa was already asleep, phone face down and locked on the nightstand exactly where it had lived for months, and I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for longer than I want to admit, just looking at her, trying to decide if the man Tom described sounded like a threat or just a friendly gym instructor, and I genuinely, honestly could not tell, and I hated that I couldn't tell, and I went to bed without waking her up to ask. My sister Susan noticed something around the same time, though she came at it from a completely different angle. Susan is 3 years older than me, lives 40 minutes away in Millersburg with her husband and their teenage sons, and she and Vanessa had always gotten along well, close enough that they texted on their own, independent of me, which I'd always considered a good sign for a marriage, your sister and your wife liking each other without you in the middle of it. At Thanksgiving that year, hosted at our house, Susan pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was carving the turkey and asked quietly if everything was okay with Vanessa, because she'd seemed distracted all day, checking her phone under the table twice during dinner, and distant in a way Susan said she'd never seen from her before, not sad exactly, just somewhere else. I told Susan work had been stressful for Vanessa, which was true. The practice had just taken on 2 new therapists, and the paperwork alone was a nightmare that month, and Susan nodded and let it go. But she said one more thing before she walked back to the dining room that I did not think about again until much later. She said, "You'd tell me if something fell off, right, Greg?" And I said, "Of course," and at the time I meant it as a reassurance. Later, I understood it as the first moment someone who loved both of us had quietly flagged that something in the room had changed shape, and I had waved it away. I want to be fair to myself here, because I think it is important for anyone listening to this who is in a similar fog right now to understand how genuinely hard it is to see clearly from inside a marriage you still trust. I was not an oblivious man. I noticed the phone. I heard Tom's warning. I registered Susan's question. But I was also a man with 2 children, a demanding job, a mortgage, and 11 years of accumulated trust in a woman I had built an entire life with. And trust, real trust, the kind that took over a decade to build, does not evaporate over a locked phone and a second-hand comment from a gym acquaintance. It takes evidence. It takes something undeniable. And for 4 more months, I did not have that. So I did what I think most people in my position would do. I chose to believe the version of events that let me keep living in the marriage I thought I had, because the alternative was unthinkable, and unthinkable things get postponed by the human mind for as long as they possibly can be. The thing that finally cracked it open had nothing to do with suspicion at all, at least not at first. It was a broken screen. In early February, 14 months into the Iron Line performance era of our marriage, Vanessa dropped her phone getting out of the car in our icy driveway, and the screen shattered badly enough that she couldn't read half of it, and she asked me, completely casually, completely without any of the tension I would later associate with that phone, if I could back it up to the cloud account we shared before she took it in for a repair, Since I handled that kind of thing in our house the way she handled the kids' paediatrician appointments, an old division of labour from years earlier that had simply never changed. I said sure, took the phone, plugged it into my laptop that night after she'd gone to bed and started the backup, and here is the detail that changed everything. The detail I have turned over in my mind 1,000 times since, wondering what would have happened if it hadn't occurred exactly this way. The backup software we used mirrored recent messages onto the connected computer screen as a preview, so you could confirm the backup was capturing the right conversations before committing to the full archive. And I was not looking for anything. I want to be completely clear about that. I was doing a favour for my wife with a broken phone, and a name I did not recognise scrolled past in the preview window, Derek H. I want to tell you honestly that even then, my first instinct was not suspicion. It was mild curiosity, the kind you'd feel seeing any unfamiliar name pop up on a screen, and I almost closed the laptop and went to bed without looking further. But some old instinct, maybe the accumulated weight of Tom's warning and Susan's question, and the locked phone and the Saturday class that was somehow always full, made my hand hesitate over the trackpad instead of closing it, and I clicked once on the preview thread, and the first messages that loaded were dated 3 days earlier, and they were not messages between a client and her fitness instructor. I'm not going to repeat every word of what I read that night, because some of it does not need repeating, but I will tell you the first line that loaded, because I have never been able to forget it. It said, "Can't stop thinking about last night," and it was signed with a small red heart, and it was not sent by my wife. It was sent to her from Derek Holloway at 11:41 the previous Tuesday night, the exact night Vanessa had told me she was at a late nutrition seminar that ran long. I sat in my home office for 4 hours that night, from a little after 11 until almost 3 in the morning, reading backward through a conversation that the preview software had mercifully, or perhaps cruelly, decided to load in reasonably full form, thread after thread going back further than I initially had the stomach to keep scrolling, and by the time the sun would have started thinking about coming up, I understood 3 things with total clarity. The first was that this had been going on for a long time, not weeks, but the better part of a year at minimum, based on how far back the thread continued before the preview limit cut it off. The second was that it had involved actual meetings, not just messages, hotel names mentioned casually the way you'd mention a restaurant, a place called the Ridgeline Inn, 2 towns over in Carverton coming up again and again, along with a handful of Tuesday and Thursday evening windows that corresponded exactly, with a precision that made my stomach turn, to the childcare hours I had personally, cheerfully, lovingly cleared in our schedule so my wife could go to the gym. The third thing I understood, and this is the one that actually changed the direction of my entire life over the following weeks, was that if I walked into our bedroom at 3 in the morning and woke Vanessa up and threw the phone at her feet and screamed, I would lose. Not lose the marriage. The marriage was already lost, I understood that within the first hour of reading, but lose the truth itself. Because a woman capable of doing what she had done for over a year, while running a fitness practice on the side of her actual practice and getting her sister-in-law to worry about her stress levels at Thanksgiving, was a woman capable of controlling a narrative, and if I confronted her with nothing but rage and a broken phone screen, the story that would exist by morning would be about my temper, not her affair. So I did something I am not entirely proud of, though I have made a complete peace with it since, which is that I put the phone down, wiped my search history on the laptop, went to bed beside my sleeping, unaware wife, and did not say a single word. In the morning I handed her the phone, told her the backup completed fine, and watched her thank me and head off to drop the kids at school, and something had already changed permanently in me by then, though nothing had changed at all in the house, in the routine, in any visible surface of our life. I had become, in the space of one sleepless night, a man building a case, and I want to walk you through exactly how I built it, because I think the method matters as much as the discovery. The first thing I did, 2 days later, was call a lawyer. Not to file anything. Not yet. But to understand what would and would not hold up if this ever became a legal matter, because Pennsylvania is not a state where infidelity automatically changes the financial outcome of a divorce, and I needed to know exactly what kind of proof would actually matter versus what kind would just make me feel righteous without accomplishing anything. I found her name through a co-worker who'd gone through his own divorce 2 years earlier and would not stop recommending her, a family law attorney in Harrisburg named Dana Whitcomb. Sharp-eyed, unhurried, The kind of woman who let you finish an entire sentence before she said a single word back to you. I sat in her office on a Thursday afternoon, having told Vanessa I had a late meeting about a shipping contract renewal, and I told Dana everything I'd seen on that screen, and she listened without a single expression crossing her face until I finished. And then she asked me one question that reorganized my entire plan. She asked, "Do you want to save this marriage, or do you want to be able to prove, beyond any doubt, exactly what happened in it? Because those are two different projects, Mr. Calloway, and you need to decide which one you're actually running before you take another step." I told her honestly that I did not know yet, and she said that was a completely reasonable answer, and that either way the next month should look identical from the outside. Do not confront her. Do not change your behaviour. Do not let her see even a flicker of what you know, because the moment she knows you know, she will either destroy evidence, get better at hiding it, or preemptively spin a story to your family and hers designed to make you look unstable or absent. And Dana said that last part with a kind of weariness that told me she had seen it play out exactly that way more times than she could count. Document everything, she told me. Dates, times, receipts, anything financial, anything you can get without breaking any laws doing it. Because Pennsylvania takes a dim view of illegally recorded conversations or unauthorized access to password-protected accounts, and I don't want you handing her lawyer a reason to throw out everything you've gathered on a technicality. Whatever you access, make sure it's something you had a legitimate reason to touch, the way you did with that phone backup, and from there on, keep your hands visibly clean. So that is what I did, for 6 weeks, while sleeping beside my wife every night, and kissing her goodbye every morning, and coaching Caleb's Saturday basketball league, and helping Emily with a diorama of the water cycle for her 4th grade class. All of it, the entire ordinary architecture of a family life, continuing exactly as it had. While underneath it I was building a folder on an external hard drive that I kept at my office instead of the house. I started with the joint credit card statements, which I had access to legitimately as a co-account holder, and I went back 14 months, and I found what I was looking for almost immediately once I knew what to look for. A charge at the Ridgeline Inn in Carverton, $118, dated the previous June, filed under what Vanessa's expense notes called a conference lunch for the practice. Except the Ridgeline Inn does not have a conference room, I called and asked. It is an 18-room roadside motel with a coffee maker in every room and a reputation, according to Tom, who knew the area from deer season, for being exactly the kind of place people go when they do not want to be seen. There were 6 more charges like it over 14 months, spaced roughly every 5 to 6 weeks, each one logged under a different plausible-sounding business explanation, a supply run, a seminar, a lunch with a referring physician, and each one falling on a Tuesday or Thursday, the 2 nights a week I had cleared for her gym schedule. I cross-referenced the dates against her phone's location history, which I could see through the family sharing settings on our shared phone plan, a feature we had turned on years earlier so we could find each other's phones if they went missing. Completely legal, completely something I had a legitimate reason to access, and every single one of those 6 dates showed her phone pinging off a cell tower in Carverton between 6 and 9 in the evening. Nowhere near Ironline Performance, nowhere near any nutrition seminar. I built a spreadsheet, and I am not ashamed to tell you that building it felt like the only sane thing available to me during those 6 weeks, because it gave the chaos in my chest somewhere organized to go. 1 column for the date, 1 column for what she told me that day, 1 column for what the credit card said, 1 column for what the location data said. By the end of 5 weeks I had 11 rows, 11 separate documented instances where her stated location, her financial trail, and her phone's actual location told 3 completely different stories, and every single one of them pointed at the same 18-room motel in Carverton and the same man's name from that first screen, Derek Holloway. I want to tell you what those 6 weeks did to me as a person, because I do not think it is a small thing, and I do not want to gloss over it just because the story has a satisfying ending. I lost 11 pounds without trying. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking at 3 or 4 every morning with my heart already racing before I remembered why. I snapped at Caleb once over something trivial, a spilled glass of milk, badly enough that he cried and I had to apologize twice, once right then and once again the next morning. And I remember standing in his doorway afterward, hating myself more than I have ever hated anything, because none of this was his fault. None of it was Emily's fault. And I was the one man in the house who was supposed to be the steady one, and I was quietly falling apart at 3 in the morning over a spreadsheet while pretending everything was fine at breakfast. I do not tell you this to earn sympathy. I tell you this because I think anyone in this position needs to hear, from someone who lived it, that the calm, methodical version of yourself you present to the world during something like this is not the whole truth of what it costs, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to anyone going through it right now. Around week 4 of my 6 weeks of quiet documentation, I noticed something that I did not understand at the time, and only made complete sense to me later, and it involved Priya Nandi, Vanessa's best friend since high school, the one who had stood near the back of the tent clapping at our wedding 14 years ago. Vanessa and Priya had always talked constantly, but that month the calls got longer, some of them lasting over an hour, always taken in the bedroom with the door closed, and once, passing by the door, I heard Vanessa's voice catch on a sentence fragment that stopped me cold in the hallway. She said, "I just need people to already be on my side before it comes out, so it doesn't look like I'm the one who blew everything up." I did not hear what came before or after that sentence, and I have thought about it more than almost anything else from those 6 weeks, because I understand now, with total clarity, exactly what I was overhearing. My wife was not confessing to Priya. She was rehearsing. She was building in real time, weeks before I ever said a single word to her about anything. The exact narrative she would eventually deliver to a room full of 31 people at her sister's 40th birthday party, the story where she was the one who suffered, the one who tried, the one who was finally forced into an impossible situation by a husband who stopped loving her. And she was building it before I had even confronted her, before there was anything for her to be defensive about yet, which told me something I had not fully let myself understand until that moment. This was not a woman who was going to get caught and feel remorse. This was a woman preparing her legal and emotional defense in advance, brick by brick, with her best friend as the foreman, and the defense had nothing to do with the truth and everything to do with which version of the story would let her keep her friendships, her family's sympathy, and her position in this town intact. I started noticing the groundwork everywhere once I knew to look for it. Vanessa began mentioning to her mother, in phone calls I could hear half of from the next room, that Greg had been so distant lately, so checked out. And her mother, a warm, easily worried woman named Carol who had always been kind to me, started asking me, gently at a Sunday dinner, if everything was all right between us, if I was working too much again. And I understood, hearing that question, that the campaign had already reached her mother weeks before anything had technically happened between Vanessa and me that a normal observer would call a crisis. She brought it up with Camille, her sister, the maid of honour at our wedding, framing it as her own private worry, wondering aloud whether Greg still finds me attractive anymore, whether he's pulling away, and Camille, protective of her older sister in the way younger sisters often are, started being noticeably cooler toward me at family gatherings, shorter answers, less eye contact, the specific chill of someone who has decided to preload sympathy for one side of a fight that has not technically started yet. I want to pause here and say something directly, because I think it is the single most important thing I learned during this entire experience. People who are planning to do something they know is wrong very often start managing the story before they manage the guilt, because managing the story is easier and gives them something to control in a situation that otherwise feels like it's spinning away from them. Vanessa was, I believe, genuinely tormented by what she was doing. I do not think she is a cartoon villain, and I will get to why I believe that later in this story, but the torment did not translate into honesty. It translated into public relations, and so, while I built a spreadsheet in a locked folder on an external hard drive, my wife built a narrative in the ears of everyone who loved her, and both of us were doing the same thing at the exact same time, without either of us knowing the other one was doing it, which is, when I really sit with it, one of the saddest facts of this entire story. We had become two people preparing for the same war from opposite trenches, neither one saying a word to the other, both of us still sleeping in the same bed every night, both of us still saying good morning and good night, both of us performing a marriage that only one of us fully knew was already over. By week 5, I had everything Dana Whitcomb told me I would need: the spreadsheet, the credit card statements, the location data exports, and, because I could not help myself one final time, a fresh screenshot preview taken during a second phone backup. Vanessa asked me to help with when her repaired screen started glitching again. A coincidence so absurd I almost laughed out loud reading it. My wife twice handing me the exact device I needed to confirm her own betrayal, because in 11 years of marriage she had simply never had a reason to imagine I would ever look. The final message thread I saw, 3 days before I finally acted, included an exchange where Derek asked her, half joking, half not, "When are you finally going to just tell him?" And Vanessa's answer, time-stamped at 11:58 at night, read, "Soon, but it has to look right. I can't be the bad guy in this. I've worked too hard for too long to be the bad guy now." And reading that sentence was the moment the last piece of guilt I might have felt about documenting my own wife's private messages evaporated completely. Because I finally understood I was not spying on a woman in the middle of a private crisis of conscience. I was watching a woman construct an alibi for her own character in real time, and I decided right there at my desk with that message glowing on the screen that the alibi was not going to hold. Camille's 40th birthday party fell on a Saturday in the 6th week of my documentation, and I want to walk you back through it now with everything you know that I did not fully appreciate until I was standing in that kitchen doorway. Vanessa had been planning the party for a month. An elegant, catered affair at Camille's house in Millersburg. 30-some guests, string lights across the back patio. A signature cocktail Vanessa had insisted on naming after an inside joke from their childhood. And I had agreed to bring 3 dozen deviled eggs, because Vanessa said Camille's caterer was light on appetizers, and it would help to have a backup. And I had made them myself that morning in our kitchen. The same recipe my own mother taught me, because some habits from childhood outlast every other thing about a person. I left the house 20 minutes before Vanessa and the kids, since I'd told her I needed to stop for ice on the way, which was true, and I arrived at Camille's earlier than anyone expected, carrying a tray covered in foil, and I let myself in through the side door the way our families always had, and that is how I ended up standing in the kitchen doorway, unseen, unheard, holding a tray of eggs, while my wife stood in the living room with a glass of white wine and told a story about our marriage to 31 people who loved her. I have already told you the broad strokes of what she said. I want to tell you the specific words now because I wrote them down that same night, word for word, as close as memory allowed, sitting in my car in Camille's driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself walk back inside and pretend I had only just arrived. She said, "I think somewhere around our 10th anniversary, Greg just stopped trying, and I don't know if it was the job or just getting comfortable. But I started to feel like I was the only one still fighting for us." She said, "I used to lie awake wondering what I did wrong, wondering if I'd let myself go, wondering if there was something about me specifically he'd fallen out of love with, and it took me a long time to understand that sometimes it isn't about you at all. Sometimes a person just decides they're done and doesn't have the courage to say it out loud, so they just slowly disappear from the marriage instead." She said, "I've cried more in the last year than I have in my whole life, and I stayed for the kids for as long as I possibly could, and I don't regret that, but I think I finally understand that staying in a marriage where only one person is actually present isn't something I can keep doing to myself." And her mother, standing beside her, put a hand on her shoulder, and Camille wiped her eyes, and Priya, standing just behind them both, nodded along with an expression of quiet, practiced solidarity. And somewhere in that circle of 31 people, not one of them had ever heard the name Derek Calloway, not one of them knew about the Ridgeline Inn, not one of them had any idea that 6 weeks earlier I had watched their sister, daughter, best friend tell a man who was not her husband that she couldn't stop thinking about the night before. I stood in that doorway for what felt like several minutes, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, holding a tray of deviled eggs I had made with my own hands that morning out of love for a family gathering, listening to my wife describe me to my face without her even knowing my face was there, as a man who quietly gave up on loving her, and I felt something shift inside my chest that I can only describe as a door closing gently without slamming. A door I had been unconsciously holding open for 6 weeks. In case some part of this turned out to be a misunderstanding, I could still forgive my way through. It was not a misunderstanding. It had never been a misunderstanding. And now it was not even an affair I was quietly documenting in private anymore. It was a false public narrative being installed brick by brick into the permanent record of our shared families, a narrative that would outlive the marriage itself and follow me for years, at every future holiday, every school function, every mutual friend's dinner party, as the man who stopped trying unless I did something about it. And I understood, standing in that doorway, that the 6 weeks of quiet documentation had been necessary preparation for exactly this moment, because now I finally had what I needed to answer the story with something stronger than my own denial. I had the truth, dated, time-stamped, and saved. I set the tray down on the counter, wiped my expression back to something neutral in the reflection of the microwave door, and walked into the party like a man who had only just arrived. And I hugged Camille, and I kissed Vanessa on the cheek, and I made small talk with her uncle about the Steelers for 20 minutes, and nobody in that room, including my wife, had any idea that the man smiling and passing appetizers around the patio had, 90 seconds earlier, watched his own eulogy delivered in advance, at a party, by the person who was supposed to love him most, and decided calmly, in the space of a single held breath, exactly what he was going to do about it. I called Dana Whitcomb first thing Monday morning, before I even dropped the kids at school, sitting in the car in the pickup line with my voice low so Emily and Caleb wouldn't hear from the back seat. And I told her what happened at the party, and she was quiet for a moment before she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Greg, I want you to understand that you now have two separate problems, and they need two separate solutions. One problem is your marriage, which from everything you've told me sounds functionally over regardless of what happens next. The other problem is your reputation, your standing with your own family and hers, and the story that gets told about why this marriage ended, and that second problem does not get solved by winning an argument in your kitchen. It gets solved by making sure the truth reaches the same people the lie reached, in a form they cannot argue with." She asked me who exactly had heard the version of events Vanessa gave at the party, and I gave her the list. Camille, their mother Carol, Priya, Vanessa's father, 2 aunts, several cousins, a handful of old family friends, more than 30 people total, and Dana said, "Then that's your audience too, eventually, not through some dramatic public scene that would only make you look unstable and vindictive, but through the actual mechanism that ends a marriage, which is a divorce filing and, if it comes to it, a mediation process where every one of those documented dates and receipts and messages becomes part of the formal record, a record her own family's lawyer would eventually see, and truth has a way of travelling through families even when nobody stages a big reveal, especially once paperwork exists that can't be argued with." But Dana also told me something I had not expected, which was that she thought I should still talk to Vanessa directly first, privately, before any filing happened, not to save the marriage. She was careful to say she was not weighing in on that decision at all, but because how the initial conversation went would shape everything downstream, including how our 2 children eventually understood what happened to their parents' marriage when they were old enough to ask real questions about it. She said, "You get one first conversation where you are calm and factual and completely unassailable, and after that every future conversation about this will be filtered through, however that first one went. Make it count. Don't do it in anger, do it in evidence." I spent the better part of that week deciding exactly how and when, and I settled on a Wednesday evening once the kids were asleep, because I did not want Emily or Caleb anywhere near what I knew was going to be an enormous conversation. And I did not want an audience of any kind, family or otherwise, because I had already decided somewhere in that kitchen doorway at the party that I was not going to fight my wife's public narrative with a competing public scene. I was going to fight it with something far more durable than a scene. I was going to fight it with a folder. Tuesday night, the night before, I could not sleep at all, and around 1 in the morning I got up and sat in my home office and read through the entire spreadsheet one more time. All 11 documented instances, all the message excerpts I had saved as time-stamped screenshots to a private cloud account Dana had helped me set up correctly, so nothing about the collection method could later be challenged. And I thought about my daughter, 10 years old, obsessed with horses and mildly furious at the universe in the specific way 10-year-old girls sometimes are. And I thought about my son, 7 years old, easygoing, still young enough to believe his parents were simply permanent weather. And I thought about the version of this story they would eventually hear from their mother's side of the family if I did nothing. The version where their father simply stopped trying, and I made a promise to myself, sitting alone in that office at 1 in the morning, that whatever else happened to this marriage, my children were eventually going to know the truth, calmly, factually, without me ever needing to raise my voice to prove it, because I had the proof already, and proof does not need volume. Wednesday night arrived the way ordinary evenings arrive even when you know they aren't going to stay ordinary. Dinner, dishes, a bath for Caleb, a chapter of a horse book read aloud to Emily, both kids asleep by 8:40, and Vanessa in the kitchen wiping down the counter in the routine, wordless choreography of 11 years of shared chores. And I remember standing in the doorway of that kitchen for the second time in 2 weeks, though this time she saw me right away. I said, "Can we sit down for a minute? I want to talk about something," and something in my voice must have carried more weight than usual, because she turned around with the dish towel still in her hand, and a look crossed her face that I recognised even then as the look of someone running quickly backward through a mental list of everything she might be about to be asked about. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd done 12 years of homework help and birthday planning and quiet Tuesday dinners, and I did not raise my voice. Not once through the entire conversation that followed, because I had promised myself in that office at 1 a.m. that I would not, because Dana had told me my calm was going to matter more than anything else I said. I told her I knew about Derek Holloway. I watched her face do something complicated, a flash of something that might have been relief mixed with something that might have been fear, and she started to say something about how it wasn't what I thought, the oldest sentence in this particular language, and I held up a folder, a physical folder, printed pages, because I wanted her to understand this was not a guess, not a suspicion, not jealousy dressed up as evidence, and I said, "Vanessa, I'm not asking you a question. I'm telling you what I know, and then I'm going to ask you one thing, and I need you to actually answer it honestly, because it's the only thing I actually still want from you tonight." I laid it out for her without embellishment. 14 months, based on the earliest message thread I'd been able to access. 6 documented hotel stays at the Ridgeline Inn in Carverton, cross-referenced against credit card charges and phone location data. The specific message from 3 weeks earlier where Derek asked her when she was finally going to tell me, and her answer that it had to look right, that she couldn't be the bad guy. I told her about the 40th birthday party, that I'd been standing in that kitchen doorway the entire time she told 31 people, that I was the one who stopped trying, and I watched the colour leave her face when I said that part, because I think until that exact sentence, some part of her had believed the two halves of her life, the one she was living and the one she was narrating to everyone else, could stay permanently separate. She cried, for a long time, and I let her, sitting across the table without moving to comfort her, which felt like one of the hardest things I have ever physically done, some old marital instinct in my body wanting to reach across and hold my wife's hand while she cried, even now, even knowing everything I knew. When she finally spoke, she did not deny any of it, and I want to give her that much credit because Dana had warned me some people, faced with documentation this complete, still tried to deny it anyway, and Vanessa did not. She said, "I don't even know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse," and then she tried anyway and I let her, because I had decided I owed myself the full explanation even if I didn't owe her the reaction she was hoping for. She told me it started small, an easy friendliness with Derek during her first few months at the gym, him noticing her effort in a way that felt good after years of feeling invisible in her own house, and I want to be honest that the phrase invisible in her own house landed on me harder than almost anything else she said that night, because I had genuinely believed, right up until February, that I was a present, engaged husband, and hearing her say she'd felt invisible made me reckon, right there at the table, with the grey stretch around year 8 that I'd told you about earlier, the hallway co-worker years, and I had to sit with the uncomfortable truth that some of what she was describing had real roots, even if nothing about those roots justified 14 months of hotel rooms and a rehearsed public alibi. She told me the first time anything physical happened was the previous spring, at a work conference she genuinely attended for the first half day, before driving back to meet Derek at the Ridgeline, and she told me that for months afterward, she'd told herself it was a mistake that wouldn't happen again, and then it happened again, and again, until the mistake became simply a second, hidden architecture running underneath the visible architecture of our marriage, 2 houses built on the same foundation, one for the neighbours and one for her. I asked her the one question I had promised myself I would ask, the only thing I actually wanted an honest answer to that night. I asked her why. If she was so unhappy, so invisible, so done with our marriage, she had spent months preparing a story to tell our families where I was the one who failed, instead of simply telling the truth, to me first, and then to them, whenever she was ready to leave. And she was quiet for a long moment, longer than any other pause in the whole conversation, and when she finally answered, she said something I think is the most honest sentence she said to me in 14 months. She said, "Because if I told the truth, I'd have to be the villain, and Derek made me feel like the version of myself I liked again, and I couldn't figure out how to leave you for him without becoming someone I couldn't stand to look at in the mirror. So I made myself into the victim instead, because the victim gets to leave and still be loved by everyone on the way out." I did not yell after she said that. I want to be honest that some part of me wanted to, badly, but what I actually felt sitting there was something closer to a strange, cold clarity. the last piece of a puzzle clicking into a shape I finally understood completely. My wife had not simply fallen out of love with me and fallen into an affair the way these things sometimes genuinely tragically happen. She had made a series of specific, sustained choices over more than a year to have both things at once, the affair and the sympathy, the escape and the reputation. And when the math of that finally stopped working, when a husband she never expected to find out anything had found out everything, she had reached instinctively for the oldest tool available to her, which was to make sure she told the story first and better, and to more people, before the truth had any chance to. I told her, at the end of that conversation, that I was filing for divorce, and that I already had an attorney, and that every piece of documentation I'd just described to her was preserved in a way that could not be disputed or deleted, and that I intended, calmly and without cruelty, to make sure our families eventually knew the actual timeline of what happened, not out of revenge, but because I was not going to spend the next 20 years being introduced at gatherings as the man who gave up on his marriage when the truth was sitting in a folder on my desk. She asked me quietly if there was any version of this where we tried to fix it, and I told her the truth, which was that I did not think I could ever fully trust a woman who had spent 14 months building a parallel life and a backup story at the same time, and that even if some love still existed underneath all of it, and I believe some genuinely did, love is not actually the load-bearing wall in a marriage. Trust is. And she'd taken a sledgehammer to that wall a little more every single Tuesday and Thursday for over a year. I expected, naively, that the confrontation itself would be the hardest part, and I want to tell you honestly that I was wrong, because the 2 weeks that followed turned out to be their own separate ordeal. Vanessa moved out first to Priya's guest room, which she framed to her own family, I later learned, as a mutual decision to give each other space while we figured things out. A phrase that made it sound like a pause rather than the ending it actually was. And within 4 days of moving out, before I had filed a single piece of paperwork, before I had said one word to anyone in either family, Vanessa's mother Carol called me, her voice tight in a way I had never heard from her in 13 years of knowing her, and said, "Greg, Vanessa told me you've decided you want a divorce, and I need you to know that this family has always loved you, but I also need to understand what happened, because she says you've become distant and cold, and she doesn't know how to reach you anymore." I sat with that phone call for a long moment before I answered it, because I understood immediately what had happened. Vanessa had gotten to her mother first, again, the same instinct that had built a narrative in advance of the birthday party now rebuilding itself in advance of the divorce filing, framing herself once more as the confused, grieving party in a marriage that had simply, mysteriously gone cold, and I had a choice in that moment that I want to walk through carefully, because I think it is the choice that mattered most in this entire story. I could have told Carol everything right then, on the phone, in anger, using the confrontation with Vanessa as ammunition to win her mother over to my side immediately. I did not do that. I told Carol, calmly, that I loved her, that I was not going to discuss the details of what happened between her daughter and me over the phone in the heat of an emotional moment, but that everything would become clear through the appropriate channels in time, and that I would always be grateful for how she had treated me over 13 years regardless of how this ended. Dana had actually coached me on exactly this kind of moment, telling me that the families of people going through this always eventually get the full truth, usually through the divorce process itself, through mediation documents, through the other party's own attorney reviewing the same evidence I had, and that trying to win the public relations war phone call by phone call before the facts naturally surfaced would only make me look like I was campaigning, the same thing I was trying not to become. The filing happened 12 days after the kitchen table conversation. Dana had prepared everything methodically, the documented instances, the financial discrepancies, all of it filed in a way that made the grounds for the divorce a matter of formal record rather than a public argument, and Pennsylvania's process meant this did not become some dramatic courtroom scene, but a quieter procedural unfolding of paperwork that nonetheless meant Vanessa's own attorney, a competent, no-nonsense man named Roger Feld that her family recommended, sat down with her at some point during that process and reviewed, in full, 11 documented instances of infidelity supported by financial records, location data, and message excerpts. And I understood, without ever needing to be in the room, that this was the moment the truth finally reached the one person whose opinion Vanessa could not spin, her own lawyer, whose entire job depended on him understanding exactly what he was actually working with. I learned what happened next, mostly through Susan, my sister, who had stayed close enough to Carol over the years that things eventually filtered back to me second-hand, the way truth in families often travels slowly, through people who love both sides and eventually cannot keep pretending they don't know what they know. Roger Feld apparently had a very direct conversation with Vanessa once he'd reviewed the discovery materials, a conversation Susan heard about because Carol mentioned it to her, almost involuntarily, at a school function months later, still processing it herself. He told Vanessa, according to what eventually reached me, that the version of events she'd been telling her family bore very little resemblance to the documented timeline, and that continuing to publicly frame herself as the aggrieved party, while this much contradicting evidence existed, was, in his professional opinion, a strategy with a very short shelf life, especially in a small town where facts have a way of becoming common knowledge, eventually regardless of who wants them to stay quiet. Carol called me again, 6 weeks after that first tense phone call, and this call was different from the first one, from the very first note of it. She asked if she could come by, alone, on a Saturday afternoon while the kids were at Susan's, and she sat at the same kitchen table where I had confronted Vanessa, and she cried, and she apologised, actually apologised, for the phone call weeks earlier, for believing the version of events she'd been given without asking harder questions first, and she said something that I have carried with me since, because I think it captures something true about how these situations eventually resolve themselves without anyone needing to stage a dramatic reveal. She said, "I raised that girl to tell the truth, Greg, and somewhere in the last year she forgot how, and I don't know if it was the affair or the fear of what the affair meant about her that made her start lying. But I know what I saw with my own eyes for 13 years, and what I saw was a good man who showed up for this family every single Sunday, every single holiday, every single time we needed anything, and I let a few weeks of a different story make me forget that, and I am sorry." Priya Nandi's reckoning came later and differently, and I want to tell that part of the story too because I think it matters as a separate thread from Vanessa's own. Priya had been more than a passive listener during those months of narrative building, based on what eventually came out during a heated exchange between Priya and Camille, that Camille later described to Susan, who described it to me in the tangled way information always eventually moves through a small town full of overlapping friendships. Priya had apparently helped Vanessa draft, almost word for word, some of the language she used at the birthday party, treating the whole project the way you might help a friend prepare for a difficult job interview, coaching her on which details to include and which to leave out, reassuring her that the marriage had probably been dying for years anyway, so this was really just an acceleration of something inevitable rather than a betrayal of anyone. Once Roger Feld's conversation with Vanessa and the actual documentation started circulating through the family in pieces, Camille apparently confronted Priya directly, asking her how she could have helped script a lie about a man who had never done anything but treat her, Priya, with total warmth for 14 years, hosting her at every holiday, remembering her birthday, driving her to the airport more than once when her own family couldn't. Priya's answer, according to Camille, was that she was just supporting her best friend the way best friends are supposed to. And Camille told her, apparently, that supporting a friend and helping her build a lie were not the same thing, and that Priya should think hard about which one she had actually spent a year doing. I do not know what became of that friendship. I know that Priya was noticeably absent from the one family gathering I attended months later, a low-key 4th of July barbecue at Susan's that Carol also came to, and nobody mentioned her name once, the particular silence a family adopts around someone they have collectively quietly decided to stop making room for. Derek Holloway's reckoning was smaller and more mundane than I expected, and in some ways less satisfying, though I have come to believe that is simply how these things usually go outside of movies. I never confronted him directly on Dana's advice, since anything resembling harassment or intimidation toward him could complicate the divorce proceedings and give Vanessa's side something to point to, and so I simply, quietly, stopped being a source of income for Iron Line Performance the day I cancelled the family membership, and let the rest happen the way small towns let things happen, which is slowly and through people talking. Word moves through a gym the way it moves through anywhere else people see each other 3 times a week, and within a couple of months, according to Tom, whose cousin Danielle still went to the 6 o'clock class, Derek's client list had thinned out considerably. Several of the mums who used to fill his evening sessions quietly switching to a different studio that opened up near the interstate, not out of some organised boycott. Nobody sent a group text about it, but out of the ordinary human instinct to not want your name associated, even loosely, with a man now known around town as the reason a 13-year marriage ended in an 18-room motel. I heard, second-hand, that he and Vanessa did not actually end up together in any lasting way once the affair became public and consequential, rather than secret and thrilling, though I want to be honest that I do not know the details of that with certainty, and I made a conscious decision fairly early in this process not to spend my remaining energy tracking the second act of my ex-wife's relationship with the man she'd betrayed our marriage for. I had 2 children who needed a present, steady father, far more than I needed to know whether Derek Holloway still returned Vanessa's calls. The divorce was finalised 8 months after that kitchen table conversation, a period that felt from the inside both impossibly long and strangely fast, filled with mediation sessions where Dana's methodical documentation meant custody, and financial discussions proceeded with far less contentiousness than either of us might have expected, because there was simply very little left to argue about once the facts were this clearly established. Vanessa and I share custody of Emily and Caleb, roughly even, though the kids' primary residence stayed with me on Larkspur Lane, since Vanessa's living situation stayed unsettled for a while as she moved from Priya's guest room to an apartment near her practice. And I want to say honestly, because I think it matters, that Vanessa has been a present loving mother throughout all of this, whatever else she was in our marriage, and I have never once tried to use what happened between us as a weapon in how we co-parent, because Emily and Caleb did not do anything to deserve inheriting their parents' war. Telling the children was, without question, the hardest single afternoon of this entire experience, harder than the kitchen table conversation, harder than the 6 weeks of quiet documentation, harder than any of the family phone calls that followed. We agreed, Vanessa and I, on Dana's strong recommendation and honestly on our own instincts as parents too, that we would tell them together, in the same room, at the same time. Using language a child psychologist Dana referred us to helped us prepare an advanced, careful, age-appropriate language that made clear this was between the grown-ups and was absolutely not caused by anything either child had done or failed to do. We sat Emily and Caleb down on the living room couch on a Sunday afternoon, both of us on the coffee table facing them, and I remember Emily's face doing something I will never forget, a kind of instant focused stillness that 10-year-olds get when they sense something enormous is happening and are trying very hard to be brave enough to hear it. Caleb Younger asked almost immediately if this meant he'd have 2 bedrooms now, in the specific, practical way 7-year-olds process catastrophe, and something about the simplicity of that question broke the tension in the room just enough for all 4 of us to get through the rest of the conversation. We told them their mother and I loved them completely and always would, that this was not their fault in any way. The grown-ups sometimes cannot stay married even when they both still love their children exactly the same amount. And we did not tell them about Derek Holloway, or the Ridgeline Inn, or the spreadsheet, or any detail a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old had no need to carry, because I made a decision early on, one I have never regretted, that my children's understanding of their mother should not be permanently shaped by the worst thing she ever did, at least not while they were still young enough that the worst thing wasn't theirs to carry. Emily cried for a long time that first week, quiet, private crying mostly done in her room with the door shut, and I sat outside that door more evenings than I want to count, not always going in, sometimes just being present on the other side of it so she'd know I was there if she wanted me. Caleb processed it more in bursts, an outburst over something unrelated a week later that was clearly about this, a period of sleeping in my room some nights that I never once turned away, and slowly, over months, both kids found their footing in the new shape of the family, the way children, with a resilience that still humbles me, generally do. I want to tell you about a moment with Emily that happened about 4 months after the initial conversation, because I think it says something important about how much children actually understand, even when you try to protect them from the details. We were driving home from her riding lesson, just the 2 of us, and out of nowhere, staring out the window, she said, "Dad, I know Mum probably told everyone it was your fault, because that's what Grandma Carol said to Aunt Susan on the phone that one time. I heard it by accident, and I just want you to know I don't think it actually was, because I used to watch you at my competitions and Mum was always the one who missed them for work, not you." I did not correct her account of things, and I did not confirm it either, because I did not want to put her in the position of choosing a side out loud to my face, but I told her that grown-up marriages are complicated in ways that are hard to explain to kids, and that whatever she had heard from anyone, the most important thing was that both her parents loved her completely. And she nodded, in the specific serious way she has, and said, "I know, I just wanted you to know I know some stuff too," and went back to looking out the window, and I drove the rest of the way home with my throat tight, thinking about how much more perceptive children are than we ever give them credit for, and how much of what adults think they're successfully hiding is actually just quietly, patiently observed. Co-parenting with Vanessa in the 2 years since has been, against my own early expectations, workable, even reasonably cordial most of the time. She apologised to me directly once, about 8 months after the divorce was finalised, sitting in my driveway in her car after dropping off the kids, an apology that felt different from anything she'd said in the immediate aftermath, less about explaining herself and more simply about naming what she'd done. She said, "I know saying sorry doesn't undo 14 months of you not knowing what was happening in your own house, and I know it definitely doesn't undo standing in front of my whole family and letting them believe you were the one who failed us, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to hear me say, clearly, that none of it was your fault. And I have told my mother and my sister that directly now too, in plain language, because you deserved that from me a long time before you got it. I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I meant it, and I want to be honest that hearing it did something quietly important in me. Not because it changed anything about the marriage, that ship had sailed permanently and I had made my peace with that, but because it meant my children, as they got older and inevitably started asking harder questions, would eventually hear the truth from both of their parents instead of just one. I want to talk now about what the year after the divorce actually looked like for me, day to day, because I think the parts of this story that matter most are not always the dramatic confrontations. They're the long, unglamorous stretch of rebuilding a life afterward, and I do not want to skip past that the way some versions of this kind of story do, jumping straight from betrayal to triumph as if the year in between didn't happen. The first few months after Vanessa moved out, our house on Larkspur Lane felt enormous and strange, full of furniture we'd picked out together and photographs I hadn't yet decided whether to take down, and I remember standing in our bedroom one night, maybe 6 weeks after she'd left, staring at her side of the closet, still half full of clothes she hadn't come to collect yet, and feeling a grief that surprised me with how physical it was, a genuine ache in my chest for the marriage I'd believed I had for 11 of the 13 years we were together, even while knowing everything I now knew about the last one. I think that surprised people who expected me to feel only anger or only relief. I felt both of those things, plenty. But underneath them I also felt something closer to mourning, because you can be furious at someone and still grieve the version of your life you built with them. And I don't think those two feelings cancel each other out. I think they just have to coexist for a while, until one of them naturally takes up less room than it used to. Tom Ferris showed up for me that year in ways I will genuinely never be able to repay, driving over unannounced some Friday nights with a 6-pack and a pizza, just so I wouldn't be alone in that too-quiet house, taking the kids for an entire Saturday twice a month, so I could have a few hours that weren't structured entirely around single parenthood and grief, and never once, not a single time in that whole year, saying I told you so about the warning he'd given me on his couch that October, which I think took a kind of restraint I'm not sure I would have managed in his position. My sister Susan drove the 40 minutes from Millersburg most Sundays for months, sometimes just to sit in my kitchen while I cooked dinner for the kids, filling the house with a second adult voice during the hours that felt loneliest. And I remember telling her once, late on one of those Sunday evenings after the kids were in bed, that I didn't know how to explain to people what it felt like to grieve a marriage and feel relieved about its ending at the exact same time. And Susan said something I have held on to since. She said, "Greg, you're not required to feel one clean feeling about this. You're allowed to miss the version of your life you thought you had, while also being glad you're not living the lie version of it anymore. Both things are just true, and anybody who needs you to pick only one of them isn't actually the person you should be explaining yourself to." I started therapy about 4 months after the divorce was finalised, something I probably should have started the week I found that first message on Vanessa's phone, but pride and busyness and simple denial kept me from it longer than they should have. My therapist, a measured, patient man named Dr. O.C. who specialises in exactly this kind of betrayal trauma, helped me understand something that reframed the entire experience for me, which was that the 6 weeks of quiet documentation, the calm, controlled version of myself I've described throughout this story, had been a genuinely healthy, adaptive response in the moment it was needed, but that staying in that controlled, evidence-gathering mode indefinitely afterward would eventually cost me the ability to feel anything at all, and that healing actually required me to go back, deliberately, and feel the parts I'd had to postpone feeling in order to function during those 6 weeks. That work was slow and occasionally ugly. Sessions where I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry, even during the worst of the actual discovery, because I'd been too busy being the methodical, unassailable man Dana needed me to be to fall apart properly at the time, and Dr. Osi helped me understand that the falling apart was not a failure of the calm version of myself. It was simply the second half of the same process, delayed but not avoided. Around the 1-year mark after the divorce, I started dating again, cautiously, at Susan's gentle, persistent encouragement, and I want to tell you about that not because it is the point of this story, but because I think people going through something like this deserve to hear that the story does not end at the courthouse steps. I met a woman named Julia Ferris, no relation to Tom despite the coincidence of the last name, a school counsellor at Emily's elementary school, who I'd actually crossed paths with at a handful of parent-teacher events over the years, without either of us registering the other as anything but a familiar face in a crowded gymnasium. We started slow, coffee after a school fundraiser, then dinner, then a genuinely terrifying evening where I introduced her to Emily and Caleb for the first time, and I want to be honest that it has not been some instant fairy tale. Blending a new relationship into a co-parenting arrangement with 2 kids still processing their parents' divorce required patience and several honest, occasionally difficult conversations. But it has been, in its slow, unglamorous way, good. The kind of good that comes from 2 adults who both know exactly what they're building this time and why they're building it carefully. The moment that finally, fully closed the loop on the story Vanessa told at Camille's 40th birthday party came almost 2 years after that party, at Camille's next milestone gathering, a housewarming for the new place she and her husband bought outside of town, and I want to tell you about it, because I think it is the most satisfying kind of ending, not because it was dramatic, but because it required nothing at all from me except showing up as myself. I brought Julia, by then a fixture in my life for almost a year, and Emily and Caleb, and I was nervous walking in, half expecting the old cold politeness some of Vanessa's extended family had shown me during the rawest months of the divorce, and instead Camille hugged me at the door, genuinely, warmly, the way she used to before any of this happened, and introduced Julia to relatives I hadn't seen in 2 years, with an easy, natural warmth that told me everything I needed to know about where the family's understanding of events had eventually settled. At some point that evening, standing near the drink table, Vanessa's Aunt Marjorie, a blunt, kind woman in her 70s who I'd always liked, put a hand on my arm and said, without any preamble at all, "Greg, I want you to know I heard the real story eventually, all of it, and I'm sorry for how I acted toward you at Thanksgiving that first year. I believed what I was told, and I should have waited to hear more before I decided anything. And I told her it was all right, that I understood why people believed the first story they heard, especially from someone they loved. And Marjorie said something I've thought about since, which was, the thing about the truth, Greg, is it doesn't need you to defend it forever. It just needs you to keep being who you actually are long enough for people to notice the story didn't match the man. I did not need to correct anyone. I did not need to circulate my own competing narrative the way Vanessa had circulated hers, because 2 years of simply consistently showing up, coaching Caleb's basketball team, attending every one of Emily's riding competitions, being present at every family gathering I was invited to with steady, uncomplicated warmth, had done the correcting on its own, slowly, the way truth usually does when you give it enough time and don't try to force it. Vanessa was at that housewarming too, and we spoke briefly, cordially, the easy, practiced cordiality of 2 people who have found their way to a workable peace for the sake of their children, and at one point, watching Caleb show his cousins a magic trick he'd been practicing for weeks, she turned to me and said, quietly, just between us, you were right, you know, about the wall and what actually holds a marriage up. I think about that a lot now, especially since, and I told her I appreciated her saying so, and we left it there, because I think both of us understood there was nothing left to add to that particular sentence, and some conversations are complete exactly at the length they naturally reach. I've not told you much yet about how any of this intersected with my job, and I think it belongs in this story, because the truth is that the 6 weeks of documentation and the 8 months of divorce proceedings that followed did not happen in some separate compartment of my life, while my career politely waited outside. I was, at the time all of this started, a regional operations director overseeing distribution for a freight company across 4 counties, a job that came with real responsibility, drivers and warehouse staff whose schedules depended on me functioning at a high level every single day. And I want to be honest that there were mornings that winter and spring when I sat in my car in the parking lot before a 7 a.m. shift meeting, running through the same 11 rows of my spreadsheet in my head, and had to consciously, physically shift my posture and my breathing before I could walk in and be the steady presence 40 employees needed me to be that day. I told exactly one person at work what was happening, my direct supervisor, a decent no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alonso, who had been through her own divorce a decade earlier, and she gave me something I did not expect, which was not sympathy exactly, but practical cover. Quietly shifting 2 of my afternoon meetings during the worst weeks so I could attend a mediation session without having to invent an excuse, and telling me plainly that she'd rather have a distracted version of me who was honest with her than a version of me pretending everything was fine while quietly falling behind. I have thought since about how much harder this entire ordeal would have been without a handful of people, Tom, Susan, Patricia, Dana, who each in their own lane simply made room for the truth instead of requiring me to perform normalcy I did not have available that year. I want to go back and describe Dana Whitcomb's office in more detail actually, because those visits became a strange kind of anchor point during the whole process, and I think the mechanics of how she worked matter to anyone who might find themselves needing a lawyer like her someday. Her office was on the second floor of a converted Victorian house in Harrisburg, 5 other attorneys sharing the building, and she kept a small dish of butterscotch candies on the corner of her desk that felt almost absurdly out of place given the kind of conversations that happened in that room. And I asked her about it once, near the end of the process, and she said, half joking, that family law is already the saddest room in most people's year. Somebody should at least offer them a piece of candy on the way out. She was blunt in a way I came to deeply appreciate, telling me early on that my instinct to want a dramatic public reckoning, some moment where Vanessa's whole family watched the truth land on her all at once, was a completely understandable instinct and also one she needed me to set aside completely, because courts and mediators and even families ultimately respond to consistency and documentation, not catharsis. And chasing the satisfying dramatic moment would cost me far more than it would ever earn me. Every time I wanted to do something bigger, angrier, more theatrical, in those 8 months, I heard her voice in my head asking whether the action served the documented truth or just served my own need to feel like I'd won something in the moment. And more often than I want to admit, the honest answer was the second one, and I didn't do it. The mediation sessions themselves, 4 of them over about 5 months, took place in a conference room at Dana's building. Vanessa and Roger Feld on one side of the table, Dana and I on the other, a neutral mediator named Howard Kessler running the actual process. And I want to tell you that the reality of those sessions was far less dramatic than anything you'd expect from how movies depict divorce, mostly quiet, careful negotiation over a parenting schedule calendar and a division of retirement accounts, occasional long silences while someone reviewed a document, Vanessa crying quietly during the second session, while we worked through the holiday custody rotation, a moment where I actually passed her a tissue from my side of the table out of an old, hard-to-kill instinct, and Howard Kessler, watching that small exchange, said something afterward that stuck with me, which was that the couples who eventually co-parent well are almost always the ones who can still do small, human things like pass a tissue across a table even in the middle of dividing up 13 years of a shared life, and that the ones who can't do that anymore usually end up fighting over everything for years afterward, in ways that mostly just hurt the kids. There is a part of this story I have not told you yet, and I debated for a long time whether to include it at all, because it complicates the clean shape of everything I've described so far, but I think leaving it out would make this a less honest account. So I want to tell you about the second discovery, the one that came almost by accident, 4 months into the divorce proceedings, and reframed something I thought I already understood completely. During one of the financial disclosure phases of mediation, where both parties are required to lay out a complete accounting of assets, debts, and significant expenditures over the preceding several years, a minor discrepancy surfaced in an old joint account we'd closed years earlier. A small recurring charge, $11 a month, to a service neither Dana nor I initially recognized, dating back nearly 4 years, far earlier than Derek Holloway or Iron Line Performance had ever entered our lives. Dana, being thorough, had her paralegal look into it, and it turned out to be a subscription to an anonymous messaging application, the kind that deletes conversations automatically after a set period, billed quietly to a card that technically belonged to our joint account, but that I had genuinely never noticed among dozens of small recurring charges over the years, gym memberships and streaming services and school fundraiser subscriptions all blurring together in a monthly statement I trusted my wife to review as carefully as I did. I confronted Vanessa about it during a break in the 4th mediation session, not in front of Howard Kessler or the lawyers, just the two of us in the hallway, and I watched her face do something I recognized immediately from the kitchen table conversation months earlier, the specific stillness of someone deciding, in real time, whether there was any point left in denying something. She told me, quietly, that there had been someone else, briefly, almost 4 years earlier, a former colleague from a physical therapy conference she'd attended alone, a situation she described as short-lived, a handful of weeks before she ended it herself out of guilt, well before Derek, well before Iron Line Performance even existed, and she said she had never told me because she had genuinely believed, at the time and in the years since, that confessing it would have destroyed something in our marriage that the affair itself kept secret, somehow hadn't. A piece of logic I found almost impossible to follow at the time, and still find difficult to fully accept even now. I want to be honest about what that second discovery did to me, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. It did not make me angrier in the way you might expect, because by that point in the process, 4 months into mediation, I had already fundamentally reorganized my understanding of the marriage around the first affair, and this was, in a strange way, simply confirmation of something I think some part of me had already quietly suspected without having language for, which was that the version of Vanessa capable of building a 14-month parallel life with Derek Holloway had not appeared out of nowhere in the fog of a gym membership. There had been an earlier version of that same capacity years before that I had simply never been given the chance to see, an understanding that did something strange and almost clarifying to my grief, because it meant I was not mourning a marriage that had been entirely solid for 11 years and then broken suddenly in year 12. I was mourning a marriage that had, apparently, contained at least 2 separate moments where my wife had decided, privately, that a version of happiness existed for her outside of what she and I had built, and had chosen, both times, concealment over honesty, not because she didn't love me. I genuinely believe some real love existed underneath all of it, but because some part of her had never developed the capacity to bring difficult truths into the light, rather than manage them quietly in the dark. I told Dana about the second discovery, and she was quiet for a moment before saying something I have carried with me since. She said, "Greg, I want you to notice something, which is that you found out about this too, not because Vanessa finally decided honesty mattered more than her own comfort, but because a paralegal noticed an $11 recurring charge during a legally mandated financial disclosure. That tells you something important about the actual pattern here, and I don't say that to be cruel to her. I say it because I think you need it clearly in front of you as you finish making your peace with all of this. It was not one affair born from one gym membership. It was a pattern of managing truth by controlling who gets to see it and when. And the sooner you stop trying to explain that pattern away as an isolated bad year, the sooner you'll actually finish grieving the parts of the marriage that were real, instead of also grieving a version of the marriage that, I suspect, never fully existed the way you remember it. That conversation with Dana, more than almost anything else in this entire process, is the one that actually let me finish. Not because it made me stop loving the good years. I still believe the good years were real. The pedestrian bridge, the wedding under the tent that nearly blew away, the trip to the Outer Banks in year 9, Emily's birth, Caleb's easy laugh, all of it actually happened and actually mattered. But it let me stop needing to reconcile those good years with a story where the betrayal was a single, uncharacteristic mistake made by an otherwise completely honest person. Because that story, I finally understood, was not quite true, and clinging to it was only prolonging my own recovery in service of a version of Vanessa that made the whole thing easier for me to have loved as long as I did. I want to talk about something that happened inside me during that first winter, a kind of internal argument I had with myself almost nightly, because I think it is the part of this story most men in my position never say out loud, and I think the silence around it does other men a disservice. There is a very specific, very quiet shame that comes with being the one who was cheated on, a shame that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with some old, unexamined wiring most of us grow up with, a wiring that whispers, late at night, that if you had been enough, somehow, sufficiently attentive, sufficiently attractive, sufficiently present, none of this would have happened, and that wiring does not care that you have a spreadsheet full of documented evidence proving the other person made a series of deliberate, sustained choices that had very little to do with anything you did or didn't do. I sat with that shame more nights than I want to admit, turning over the grey stretch around year 8, wondering if a different, more attentive version of myself in those years could have prevented all of it. And it took Dr. Osei several months of sessions to help me separate two things that had gotten fused together in my head, which were, first, the entirely fair, useful work of asking honestly what I could have done differently as a husband during the years our marriage went quiet, and second, the entirely unfair, useless work of holding myself responsible for a series of decisions Vanessa made alone, in hotel rooms, over 14 months, that I never knew about, and could not have consented to or prevented no matter how attentive a husband I had been. Dr. Osei told me something in one of those sessions that I think about often now. He said, "Greg, there is a difference between a marriage that had real problems, which yours did, every marriage does eventually, and a marriage where one partner responded to those problems by building a secret second life and then constructing a public narrative blaming the other partner for the collapse. The first thing is simply what happens to two ordinary flawed people who love each other and get tired and stretched thin over a decade of children and mortgages and long work hours. The second thing is a choice, made and remade dozens of times over 14 months, by one specific person, and you are allowed to hold both of those truths at once without confusing them into a single indictment of yourself. You did not make her choose concealment over honesty. She did that every single Tuesday and Thursday on her own. I want to tell you what finally let that shame lift, because I think it is useful for anyone listening to this who is sitting with the same quiet, unfair voice at 3 a.m. It was not a single dramatic realization. It was watching myself, over months, keep showing up, keep coaching the basketball team, keep making the deviled eggs for family parties, keep being present at every school function, keep being, in other words, exactly the husband and father I had always believed myself to be, and slowly understanding that the man in that description had never actually stopped existing. He had simply been temporarily obscured by a story someone else told about him at a birthday party. The man Vanessa described in that living room, distant, checked out, someone who quietly gave up on loving his family, was never the man doing any of those things. He was a character she needed to exist in order for her own story to make sense, and the longer I kept living as the actual man instead of the character, the more the character simply stopped having anywhere left to live. I want to return, for a moment, to a conversation with Emily that happened almost 3 years after the initial confrontation, because I think it belongs near the end of this story, rather than closer to the beginning, since it required her to be old enough to actually hold the fuller truth. She was 13 by then, and one evening, unprompted, doing homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner, she asked me directly what actually happened between me and her mother, saying she was old enough now to hear the real version, instead of the careful, protective version we'd given her at 10. I sat down across from her and I told her, honestly, in language appropriate for a 13-year-old, but without the euphemisms we'd used 3 years earlier, about Derek Holloway, about the messages, about the 6 weeks of documentation, about the birthday party and what her mother had told 31 people. I watched her face move through something complicated while I talked, and when I finished she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that undid me a little. Sitting there at that table, she said, "I always kind of knew it wasn't as simple as what Grandma Carol used to say, because you were always just here, Dad, at everything. Every single thing, and people who stopped trying don't show up to every single thing." And I told her that I was proud of how she'd figured that out on her own, long before anyone told her the details, and she said quietly, "I just wish Mum had trusted us enough to tell the truth from the beginning, instead of making us find it out in pieces." And I did not have a better answer for that than the one I gave her, which was that some people find it easier to manage a story than to tell a hard truth, and that the bravest thing any of us can do in a marriage or anywhere else is choose the hard truth first, before we ever need someone else to uncover it for us. I want to go back to Julia now, because I skipped past something important earlier in the interest of getting to the family reckoning, and I think her part of this story deserves more room than I initially gave it. Our early months of dating were shadowed, more than I liked to admit at the time, by a specific fear I hadn't fully named even to myself, which was a low-grade, constant vigilance for any sign that Julia might eventually become another version of the same story, a fear that made me, for a while, a genuinely difficult person to be newly in love with. I checked her explanations for small things too carefully. I noticed, with an attention that embarrassed me even as I was doing it, when she left her phone face down on a table and had to consciously talk myself through the fact that a phone face down on a restaurant table is simply a normal thing. Millions of people do for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with hiding anything. Julia, to her enormous credit, noticed this in me within the first couple of months, and instead of being offended by it the way she would have had every right to be, she asked me directly over dinner one night to tell her the whole story. All of it. Not the polite summary version, because she said she'd rather understand exactly what she was up against in me than keep bumping into the edges of it without knowing its shape. I told her everything that night. The phone backup, the 6 weeks, the birthday party, the second discovery during mediation, all of it. And she listened the way Donna used to listen, without interrupting, and when I finished she said something that genuinely changed the trajectory of our relationship. She said, "Greg, I'm not going to spend the next however many years auditioning to prove I'm not Vanessa. That's not a fair role for either of us. But I am willing to be patient while you figure out the difference between reasonable caution and a fear that's actually still about her. I think that's a fair thing to ask of you, and I think you're capable of it. But I need you to actually do the work instead of just quietly watching me for the rest of our lives." I went back to Dr. Osi with that conversation practically the following week, and we spent several months specifically on the question of how to rebuild the capacity for trust after it has been broken by someone else, work that was slower and in some ways harder than anything from the divorce process itself, because there was no spreadsheet to build this time, no external documentation that could settle the question, just the daily, unglamorous practice of choosing to believe someone new was telling me the truth, and being willing to be occasionally wrong about that in the service of actually having a real relationship instead of a permanently guarded one. Julia and I have been together 2.5 years now, and I asked her to marry me last spring on that same pedestrian bridge over the river downtown, though I want to be honest and tell you I thought hard about whether that location carried too much old weight to reuse, and ultimately decided that a bridge is just a bridge, and that letting one painful history keep me from a place I genuinely loved in this town would be its own quiet defeat I didn't need to hand anyone. She said yes, and Emily, who had grown close to Julia over those 2.5 years in a way that still moves me every time I think about it, cried harder than I did, and Caleb asked, with total seriousness, whether this meant Julia would also come to his basketball games now, and when I told him of course she would, he seemed satisfied that the important logistics had been settled. I think a lot now about what it means to rebuild trust as a specific practice skill rather than something that simply either exists or doesn't, and I think that understanding is maybe the single most valuable thing this entire ordeal taught me. More valuable, honestly, than the vindication of the documentation itself. Before any of this happened, I think I believed trust was a kind of fixed emotional weather, something you either had with a person or didn't, and that once broken, it either slowly regrew on its own or it didn't. What I learned instead is that trust is closer to a discipline, something you build through hundreds of small, consistent, verifiable choices over time, the same way Vanessa's 14 months of concealment were built through hundreds of small, consistent, deliberate choices in the opposite direction. And that understanding trust as a discipline rather than a feeling is what finally let me risk building it again with someone new, carefully, deliberately, one verified season at a time, instead of either refusing to ever trust again or naively handing it over completely on faith the way I had, without realizing it, done the first time. I want to circle back to Tom Ferris one more time, because there is a coda to his part of this story that I think matters. About 1.5 years after my own divorce, Tom called me late on a Tuesday night, his voice unsteady in a way I had genuinely never heard from him in over 20 years of friendship, and told me he thought his own wife, Renee, might be having an affair, describing a set of small individually explainable changes that sounded to my ear uncomfortably familiar. A new gym schedule, a phone that had recently acquired a passcode for the first time, longer showers, a new closeness with a co-worker whose name kept coming up more than it used to. I sat with Tom on the phone for 2 hours that night, not telling him what to think, but walking him, gently, through the exact process Dana had walked me through. Document quietly. Don't confront in anger. Get legal advice before you get emotional advice. Understand that every individual thread might genuinely be innocent, and that the only way to know for certain is to look at the whole cloth, rather than reacting to any single thread. Tom's situation, as it turned out, over several weeks of careful, unemotional attention, resolved itself very differently than mine had. Renee was not having an affair. She had, it turned out, been secretly meeting with a financial planner and locking her phone because she was quietly organising a surprise, a down payment she'd been saving toward without telling him, for a lake house they'd talked about for years as a someday dream, and the new gym schedule was genuinely just a new gym schedule. I think about that difference often because I want to be honest in telling this story that not every pattern of secrecy is a betrayal, and not every locked phone is hiding an affair, and I would hate for anyone listening to this to walk away thinking that the specific method I used, patient, careful, evidence-based observation, exists only to catch people doing something wrong. It exists, more fundamentally, to replace panic and accusation with actual information. And sometimes the actual information is devastating, the way mine was, and sometimes the actual information is a lake house down payment. And either way, you're better off knowing the truth calmly than reacting to your fear of the truth loudly. Tom thanked me, more than once, for talking him through those weeks instead of either dismissing his fear or feeding it. And Renee, once she found out what Tom had briefly suspected and why, was gracious about it in a way I found genuinely admirable, telling him she understood exactly why the pattern had looked the way it looked, and that she was glad he'd chosen to investigate calmly instead of confronting her in a panic over something that, in her case, turned out to be a gift. I have thought a great deal, in the years since all of this happened, about why the specific method mattered as much as it did. Why the 6 weeks of quiet, methodical documentation ended up serving me so much better than an immediate emotional confrontation would have. And I think the answer comes down to something simple that took me a long time to fully understand. An accusation without evidence gives the other person total control over the narrative, because they can deny, minimize, or reframe anything you say as long as it's just your word against theirs, your feelings against their explanation. Evidence removes that particular escape hatch, not out of cruelty, but because it makes honesty the only remaining option. And I think that is exactly why Vanessa did not try to deny anything once I laid out that folder on the kitchen table. There was, for the first time in 14 months, nowhere left for the story to hide. Julia and I got married last October, 3.5 years after that Wednesday night at the kitchen table, in a small ceremony at a restored barn venue about 20 minutes outside Ashford Falls. Nothing like the tented backyard wedding of my first marriage, deliberately smaller, deliberately quieter, just family and close friends, Emily as one of Julia's bridesmaids at 13, glowing with an unmistakable pride the entire day, and Caleb, 10 by then, serving as my best man alongside Tom, a role he took with a seriousness that made half the room laugh, and the other half tear up watching him hand me the ring with both hands, like he was passing off something enormously important, which, to him, he clearly was. My sister Susan gave a toast that managed to be both hilarious and, by the end, quietly devastating in the best way, talking about the year she drove to my house most Sundays just to keep the silence from getting too loud, and thanking Julia, directly, for being the kind of steady, patient person our family needed walking into it. Carol, Vanessa's mother, was not there, which felt right to both of us given how much water had passed under that particular bridge, but she sent a card, a genuinely warm one, wishing Julia and me a lifetime of the kind of steadiness she said she'd watched me demonstrate for 13 years running, and I kept that card tucked in a drawer in my office, because I think it represents something true about how thoroughly the actual facts of this story eventually reorganized themselves in the minds of the people who mattered. Vanessa sent a card too, smaller, simpler, congratulating us and wishing the kids well, and I want to be honest that receiving it produced a far more uncomplicated feeling in me than I would have predicted years earlier, a kind of settled, unhaunted gladness that our co-parenting relationship had reached a place calm enough to allow something as ordinary as a wedding. Congratulations card between two people who used to be married to each other. Emily told me, a few weeks after the wedding, that her mother had cried a little reading about it. Not out of any lingering desire to be back in the marriage. Emily was careful to clarify, but out of something closer to relief that everyone involved, including the children caught in the middle of it for years, had eventually found their way to something stable and good. And I believe that, because I think whatever else is true about the choices Vanessa made during those 14 months, she has never stopped loving Emily and Caleb with her whole heart, and their steadiness has always mattered to her as much as it has mattered to me, even when almost nothing else between us was steady at all. I think about the arc of this whole story often now, usually on ordinary evenings that have nothing dramatic about them at all, making dinner with Julia while Caleb does homework at the counter and Emily FaceTimes a friend from her room, the exact kind of unremarkable domestic scene I once thought I already had permanently, back before I understood how much of what I thought I had was actually only half true. I do not think of myself as a victim in this story anymore, though I certainly felt like one during parts of it, sitting in that car outside Camille's house for 40 minutes, unable to make myself walk back inside. I think of myself now as someone who was handed a false story about his own life and quietly, patiently, without ever raising his voice, replaced it with a true one, not through revenge, not through a dramatic public reckoning, but through the much slower, much less satisfying, ultimately far more durable method of simply documenting what actually happened, and then continuing to live as the man I actually was, in full view of everyone, until the false story had nowhere left to survive. I want to tell one more story before I close this out, because I think it captures something about how thoroughly the truth eventually settled into place, and it happened almost entirely by accident, at a hardware store of all places, about 2 years after the divorce. I was picking up supplies for a fence repair, that same crooked backyard fence on Larkspur Lane I'd been meaning to fix since we first bought the house 13 years earlier, and had finally, somewhat symbolically, gotten around to, and I ran into Camille's husband, Marcus Dell, in the lumber aisle, someone I had always liked but hadn't spoken to much directly during the roughest years of the divorce, since most of my contact with that side of the family had naturally routed through Camille or Carol. Marcus set down the post he was examining and said, "Actually, Greg, I've been meaning to tell you something for a while, and never found the right moment," and he told me that in the early weeks after the birthday party, before anyone knew the full story, he had privately found himself annoyed with me, based entirely on what Vanessa had said that night, and had said as much to Camille once, something along the lines of wondering what had really gone wrong on my end, and Camille had apparently corrected him immediately and firmly, telling him that whatever ended up being true, Marcus needed to remember that he'd watched me show up personally to help her and Marcus move apartments twice, to drive 2 hours round trip to pick up her kids from a cancelled camp bus once when nobody else could get there in time, to help Marcus's own father with a home repair project the summer before any of this happened, and that a man capable of all of that quiet, unglamorous reliability over so many years didn't become a different person overnight, just because his wife said he did. Marcus told me he'd carried a little bit of shame ever since for that early uninformed reaction, and wanted me to know that Camille had defended me before she even knew the specifics, purely because she trusted the years of evidence she already had about who I actually was. I think about that hardware store conversation often, because I believe it captures the actual mechanism by which truth wins out in situations like this one, slower and less satisfying than people often want it to be, but ultimately more solid. It is not usually one dramatic confrontation that changes everyone's mind all at once. It is dozens of small, private moments, a sister defending you before she has proof, a mother-in-law recalibrating after a lawyer's conversation reaches her second hand, a friend's husband finally saying something in a lumber aisle 2 years later, each of them small, quiet corrections accumulating in the background of a life you're simply still living, faithfully, in full view, while somebody else's constructed story slowly runs out of oxygen. I have also had time, in the years since, to think honestly about what I would tell someone standing exactly where I stood that night in my home office. Reading a stranger's name scroll past on a phone I was only supposed to be backing up. I would tell them, first, that the instinct to slow down instead of confronting immediately is not weakness. It is the single most powerful thing you can do for yourself in that moment, because rage feels like action, but usually accomplishes less than patience does. I would tell them to find one person, a lawyer, a trusted friend who has been through something similar, anyone with enough distance from the situation to think clearly when you cannot, and let that person help you build a plan instead of building one alone in the dark at 3 a.m. I would tell them that the version of themselves who stays calm and methodical during the worst discovery of their life will eventually need somewhere private to fall apart afterward, and that finding that somewhere, whether it's therapy or a patient friend or simply time, is not optional. It is part of the actual work of surviving this, not a luxury for people who have the energy left over for it. And I would tell them, most of all, that the story someone else tells about you, however many people believe it in the moment, is not more powerful than the years of actual evidence you leave behind simply by continuing to be who you have always been, in full view, for as long as it takes people to notice the two stories don't match. I want to talk about fatherhood specifically now, because I think it deserves its own space in this story rather than being folded entirely into the divorce narrative, and because it was, more than the legal proceedings, more than the family reconciliations, the thing that actually organised my days during the hardest stretch of all of this. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with being the primary steady household during a period when your entire internal world is in upheaval. Getting Emily to riding lessons on Saturday mornings after a Friday night spent rereading message threads for a mediation prep session, making sure Caleb's basketball uniform was washed and ready, while quietly building a financial disclosure spreadsheet at midnight. And I want to be honest that there were evenings I did not do this well. Evenings I was short-tempered or distracted or simply present in body without being present in any way that mattered. And I have made a point since of naming those evenings to my kids as they've gotten older, apologising specifically for a handful of moments I remember clearly because I think modelling accountability for my own failures, even small ones, matters as much in this story as documenting Vanessa's. Caleb particularly went through a stretch about a year after the divorce where he became fixated, in the specific way young boys sometimes latch onto a single worry, on whether I was going to leave too, asking me directly more than once if I was going to get tired of him and Emily the way Mum got tired of us. A sentence that came from somewhere Vanessa never intended. Some overheard fragment of an adult conversation misfiled into a child's understanding of what happened, and I remember sitting with him on his bed more nights than I can count that year, telling him, patiently, every single time he asked, that grown-ups sometimes cannot stay married to each other, but that has nothing to do with whether they can stay a parent to their children forever, and that I intended to be his father for the rest of his life, regardless of what happened with anyone else. And slowly, over months, that fear loosened its grip on him, not through one conversation, but through dozens of small repeated moments of me simply still being there in the morning, every morning the way I always had been. Emily's path through all of this looked different, more intellectual, more oriented toward understanding the mechanics of what happened rather than fearing abandonment the way Caleb did, and I think that is simply a reflection of who she has always been, someone who processes hard things by understanding their structure. She asked me around age 12 whether I thought people could ever fully trust someone again after being betrayed like that, and I told her about Dr. Osie's framing. Trust as a discipline built through small verified choices rather than a feeling that either exists or doesn't. And she sat with that for a long moment before saying, so it's less like a switch and more like a muscle. And I told her that was exactly right. Better put than I had ever managed to put it myself. And I've used her phrase, trust is a muscle, in conversations with other people since, because a 13-year-old girl found the cleanest possible way to say something I'd needed 2 years of therapy to fully understand. I want to describe one more mediation session in detail, the third one, because it contained a moment I have never fully told anyone about outside of Dr. Osei's office, and I think it belongs in this account. We were working through the division of a small joint investment account that Vanessa and I had built together over the years, nothing enormous but meaningful, money we had set aside originally for a kitchen renovation we kept postponing, and Howard Kessler was walking us through a proposed split when Vanessa, unprompted, said she didn't want half of it. She wanted me to have the whole account because she said quietly, looking at the table rather than at me, that money was supposed to be for something we were building together, and I don't think it's right for me to take half of something I broke while it was still being built. Roger Feld, her own attorney, looked faintly uncomfortable at his client volunteering to walk away from money she was legally entitled to, and gently suggested she think it over rather than deciding in the room, and she said she'd already thought it over, plenty, in the weeks leading up to that session, and that this was one thing she wanted to be sure was actually fair rather than merely legal. I did not expect that moment, and I want to be honest that it complicated briefly the clean anger I'd been carrying into that mediation room for months. Dana, afterward in the hallway, told me she'd seen this before occasionally, in cases with an unusually large amount of documented undeniable evidence, a kind of late genuine remorse that shows up once a person can no longer manage the story at all and simply has to sit inside the truth of what they did, and she said it didn't erase anything. It didn't change what had happened over 14 months or what had happened at that birthday party, but it was, in her professional opinion, worth acknowledging honestly rather than dismissing as merely strategic, because not every gesture made by someone who has done something terrible is itself a manipulation. Sometimes it is simply a person trying, imperfectly and too late, to be decent about at least one part of a situation they handled badly for a very long time. I accepted the kitchen renovation account, eventually put toward an actual kitchen renovation 2 years later, one Julia and I designed together, And I think about that mediation room moment sometimes when I catch myself wanting to flatten Vanessa entirely into a single, simple villain for the purposes of telling this story cleanly. She was not simple. She made a series of deliberate, sustained, damaging choices over 14 months, and she orchestrated a public narrative that tried to make me the reason for the very failure she caused, and none of that is complicated or ambiguous, and I have never once, in 3.5 years, second-guessed my decision to end the marriage, or to make sure the truth eventually reached the people who needed to hear it. But she was also, underneath all of that, a full person capable of a genuinely selfless gesture in a mediation room, capable of real love for our children, capable, eventually, of real remorse. And I think holding both of those truths at once, rather than needing her to be purely monstrous in order to feel justified in my own choices, has actually been part of what let me finish grieving and move forward as completely as I have. I think, if I am honest, that the version of fatherhood I practice now is different, and I believe better, than the version I practiced before any of this happened. Not because betrayal is ever something to be grateful for. I want to be completely clear that I am not telling anyone this experience was secretly a gift. It was not. It was one of the worst things that has ever happened to me, and I would undo it in a heartbeat if I could. But I am a more attentive, more present, more emotionally available father now than I was during the comfortable, distracted years before any of this started, because the entire ordeal forced me to sit still with my own children's fear and grief in a way my old, busier, more work-consumed self might have delegated or rushed past. And I think Emily and Caleb, whatever else they lost in this story, ended up with a more fully present father on the other side of it than they had walking in, and that is not nothing, even against everything else that was lost. I want to return, one more time, to the specific moment that gives this whole story its shape, standing in that kitchen doorway at Camille's 40th birthday party, holding a tray of deviled eggs, listening to my wife tell 31 people that I was the reason our marriage failed, because I think it deserves a fuller reckoning now that you know everything that came before and after it. I've asked myself, many times since, why that specific moment cut deeper than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. Deeper, in some ways, than the original discovery on her phone, and I think I finally understand the answer. Finding out about an affair is devastating, but it is in its own terrible way a private wound. Something that happens between two people, even when other people eventually learn about it. What happened in that living room was different. It was the deliberate conversion of my private devastation into public currency, spent to purchase sympathy and cover at my direct expense, without my knowledge or consent, in front of people who loved us both. And I think that specific violation, the theft of my own story to fund someone else's alibi, is what actually organised the 6 weeks of documentation that followed, more than the affair itself did. I was not just trying to prove infidelity. I was trying to reclaim authorship of my own life, which someone else had started writing without asking me. I think that distinction matters for anyone listening to this who has been through something similar, because I believe there are two separate injuries in a story like mine, and they require two different kinds of healing. The affair itself is a wound about trust, about the specific person you loved and what they did or didn't do with the years you gave them. And that wound heals, slowly, through grief and therapy and time, and eventually, if you're fortunate, through learning to trust someone new. But the public narrative, the version of events spread deliberately to family and friends, is a different injury entirely, a wound about your own reputation, your own standing in a community you didn't choose to have contested, and that wound does not heal through grief or time alone. It heals only through the patient, sometimes years-long process of letting the truth outlast the lie in the minds of the people who matter to you, which is slower and less satisfying than a single dramatic confrontation, but is, in my experience, the only method that actually works permanently, because a story you win through documentation and consistency cannot later be undone with a single counter-accusation, the way a shouting match in a living room can be spun into he's the one who's unstable by whoever tells it next. I have thought, too, about what it means that the title of this account of my life includes the phrase "the reason our marriage failed," because I think that framing itself deserves scrutiny before I close this out. I do not think marriages fail for one reason, ever, even the ones that end in something as clear-cut as infidelity. Ours had real problems years before Derek Holloway existed, a grey stretch where two overworked, overwhelmed people stopped reaching for each other the way they once had, and I've never pretended those years didn't happen, or didn't matter. And I have never told my children that their mother was simply, purely a villain with no context behind her choices. But there is an enormous difference between contributing to a marriage's difficulties and being the reason it failed, and I think that distinction is exactly what got erased, deliberately, the night of that birthday party, when years of ordinary marital struggle got quietly repackaged as my unilateral abandonment, in order to make room for a story where leaving looked less like a choice and more like a rescue. I want to spend a little more time on the text messages themselves, because the title of this account promises them, and I think the specific granular detail of what I actually read that first night matters more than the summary I gave earlier, since I believe the small, ordinary language of betrayal is often more devastating than the dramatic version people expect. It was not a single shocking confession. It was hundreds of small, mundane exchanges that, cumulatively, painted a complete second marriage running parallel to my real one. Good morning texts sent at 6:40 in the morning, the exact time I was usually still asleep beside her. A running joke about a mutual dislike of a particular protein powder flavour that had clearly been established over months of familiarity. A message from Derek reading, my kids asked why I seem happier lately, and I told them I finally found a good workout routine, which read, to me, sitting in my office at 1 in the morning, as a small, casual cruelty I do not think he even intended as cruel. Simply a man rationalising his own choices to his own children, the same way Vanessa was rationalising hers to her own family. There was a thread from the previous Valentine's Day, a holiday I remembered clearly because Vanessa and I had exchanged cards and gone to dinner at our usual anniversary restaurant that same evening, that showed her texting Derek before I woke up that morning, something small and simple, happy Valentine's Day. Wish today looked different. And then, hours later, a photo she'd apparently taken of the flowers I'd sent to her office, captioned only, from Greg, followed by a single laughing emoji sent to Derek, and I want to tell you honestly that of everything I read that night, that specific exchange, my actual gift to her, photographed and mocked in a private joke with the man she was betraying me with, cut deeper than almost anything else. Because it took something genuine I had done out of real love and repurposed it as material for a joke I was never meant to see. The same fundamental theft that would later happen to my entire marriage at that birthday party, just on a smaller, earlier scale. I also found, scrolling further back than I initially meant to go, a message from Derek asking Vanessa, fairly early in whatever this was, are you sure you're not just going to feel guilty about this forever? And her answer, which I have never been able to fully shake, saying, probably. But I think I felt guilty about smaller things for longer, so I might as well feel guilty about something that actually makes me happy. And reading that sentence taught me something about the actual psychology of what happened that I don't think I could have understood any other way. This was not a woman stumbling into temptation and getting swept away by circumstance. This was a woman who had consciously, deliberately calculated that the specific flavour of guilt she'd feel from an affair was preferable to some other, older guilt she'd apparently been carrying for longer, something rooted, I suspect, in whatever unresolved thread connected back to that earlier, 4 years prior situation Dana's paralegal eventually uncovered, an understanding that gave me a strange, unwanted kind of clarity about how long some part of my marriage had actually been quietly unravelling beneath a surface that looked, from where I stood, completely calm. I include these specific details not to shame anyone further than the facts already do, but because I think people going through something similar deserve to know that the proof, when it finally arrives, rarely looks like a single dramatic sentence. It looks like hundreds of small, ordinary exchanges that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. And learning to read that pattern, to see the whole cloth instead of getting lost defending or explaining away any single thread, was the actual skill that let me build an unshakable case, instead of an emotional accusation that could be argued away one message at a time. I've not yet told you about my own parents in all of this, and I think their part of the story deserves a place here, because it surprised me, and because I think it says something about how differently people react depending on their own history. My father, Walter Calloway, a retired machinist who spent 34 years at the same plant in Millersburg before it closed, has never been a man of many words. And when I finally told my parents what had happened, sitting at their kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon a few weeks after the confrontation, he was quiet for a long time, longer than my mother's immediate tearful sympathy, and then he said something I did not expect from him. He He said, "Greg, I want you to understand something about your grandfather, my father, who none of you ever met because he passed before you were born. He did something similar to your grandmother for about 2 years back in the 60s, and she found out and she stayed, and I watched growing up what staying cost her, every single day of my childhood, a kind of low, permanent sadness that never fully lifted even decades later. I am telling you this because I need you to know that whatever you decide to do, leaving is not a failure, and I would rather watch my son go through a hard divorce than watch him become my mother, quietly diminished in his own house for the next 30 years, because he thought staying was the noble thing to do." I'd never heard that story about my grandparents before that Sunday afternoon, and learning it reframed something for me that I had not expected needed reframing, which was my own quiet, unexamined assumption that divorce itself represented some kind of personal failure on my part, a family pattern broken rather than a family pattern, unknowingly repeated and finally interrupted. My mother Diane added her own piece to that afternoon, telling me that she had always privately worried, watching Vanessa and me build our life together, that I had a tendency, inherited I think from watching my own father, to absorb a difficulty quietly rather than naming it out loud, and that she was proud, genuinely proud, of how directly and calmly I had handled confronting Vanessa once I knew the truth, because she said it was not the way she would have predicted her quiet, conflict-avoidant son handling something this large, and that watching me do it had taught her something about who I had actually grown into, separate from who she had always assumed I still was. That conversation with my parents did something important that I had not gotten from Dana, or Tom, or Susan, or even Dr. Osei, which was a kind of generational context, a sense that the pattern of quiet suffering I might have fallen into had I not built that spreadsheet and confronted Vanessa with evidence instead of simply absorbing the injury the way my grandmother apparently had for decades, was not some abstract cautionary tale, but a real, specific woman in my own family line who had lived and died inside exactly that kind of quiet diminishment, an understanding that gave the entire 6 weeks of documentation a weight and a purpose that went beyond my own individual marriage. I was not just protecting my own reputation or my own children's understanding of what happened. I was, in some small way, finally interrupting something that had been quietly passed down through at least 2 generations of men in my family who mistook silent endurance for strength, and choosing instead a version of strength that involved speaking the truth clearly, calmly, and with evidence, rather than simply absorbing the lie and calling the absorption dignity. It has been 3.5 years now since that Wednesday night at the kitchen table, and I sat down to record this account on an ordinary Tuesday evening in early spring. The kind of evening that has nothing dramatic about it at all, which I think is exactly the point of everything I've told you. Julia is upstairs helping Emily, now 14, with an essay for school. Caleb, 11, is in the backyard shooting baskets against the same crooked fence I finally fixed 2 summers ago. The thud of the ball against the backboard drifting faintly through the window while I talk into this microphone. The house is warm and a little loud in the specific comfortable way a house sounds when it is actually fully lived in by people who trust each other, and I think if you had told the version of me sitting in his car outside Camille's house 3.5 years ago, unable to make himself walk back inside, that this is where he would eventually end up, he would not have believed you. Not because it sounded too good, but because that version of me could not yet imagine feeling steady again at all. I want to acknowledge, before I close this out, that I know some people listening to this will wonder whether documenting a spouse's private messages the way I did crosses some line of its own, and I want to address that honestly rather than pretend the question doesn't exist. I did not hack into anything. I did not install spyware or break a password or access anything I did not already have a legitimate, invited reason to touch. A phone handed to me for a backup, a location sharing feature we had both turned on years earlier by mutual agreement, a joint credit card statement I was legally entitled to review as a co-account holder. Dana was extremely clear with me from our very first meeting that anything gathered through illegitimate means, an installed tracking app, a guest password, an intercepted call, would not only be inadmissible but could expose me to real legal jeopardy of my own, and she was right to be strict about that boundary, because it meant that everything I eventually laid on that kitchen table was not just true, it was also clean, gathered in a way that could withstand any scrutiny anyone ever wanted to apply to it. I think that distinction matters enormously for anyone in a similar position, because the goal is never to become someone who violates another person's privacy in order to catch them violating your trust. The goal is to pay careful, honest attention to what is already legitimately in front of you, and to resist the urge to go further than that, because the moment you cross that line yourself, you hand the other side a genuine grievance to use against you, and you become, in some real sense, a version of the same person who chose deception over honesty. I do not know everything that happens next for Vanessa, and I have made a genuine, ongoing peace with not needing to know it. Her practice is still respected in the county. She is, as far as I can tell and as far as our children report, a present and loving mother during her custody weeks, and I believe, whatever else is true about the choices she made during those 14 months, that she loves Emily and Caleb completely, and I do not need her story to end badly in order for mine to have ended well. I think that is maybe the last thing I want to say clearly for anyone listening to this who is still early in a story like mine, still in the 6 weeks of quiet documentation, still sitting in a car outside somewhere unable to walk back inside. You do not need the person who wronged you to suffer in order for you to heal. You need the truth to exist clearly, permanently, in a form that cannot be argued away, and then you need to keep living faithfully as exactly who you actually are, until the people who matter to you notice, on their own timeline, in their own way, that the story someone else told about you never matched the man standing in front of them the whole time. I want to say one more thing about Camille, Vanessa's younger sister, whose 40th birthday party gave this whole story its opening scene, because our arc through all of this deserves a final word of its own. Camille told me, almost a year after the divorce, over coffee she'd asked to get with me specifically, one-on-one, that she had struggled for months with a private guilt of her own, not for anything she'd done, but for having hosted the very party where her sister delivered a false version of events to their entire extended family, a party Camille had planned and paid for and stood beside her sister at, while 31 guests absorbed a story she later learned was fundamentally untrue. She told me she wanted me to know she felt genuinely sick about it, once she understood the actual timeline, and that she had spent a long time wondering whether she should have somehow sensed something was off that night, some tell in Vanessa's voice or expression, and I told her, honestly, that I didn't think she could have known, because I hadn't fully known myself until I'd spent 6 weeks building a spreadsheet to prove it to myself, and that the entire design of what Vanessa had done depended precisely on nobody in that room having any reason to doubt her. Camille cried a little at that coffee and told me she was grateful I didn't hold the party itself against her, and I told her I never had, not once, because hosting a party where your sister lies to your family is not the same as lying yourself, and she needed to let herself off a hook she'd clearly been carrying alone for a long time. Camille and I have stayed close since, closer in some ways than we were before any of this happened, and I think that friendship, unexpected and genuinely valuable, is one of the quieter gifts to come out of an otherwise painful ordeal. She was, in the end, one of the people whose steady, eventual reconciliation with the actual facts mattered most to me. Not because I needed her specific approval, but because she'd been standing in that living room the night the full story was told, and watching her come, on her own timeline, to a full and clear-eyed understanding of what actually happened felt like watching one small, specific piece of the record finally correct itself. If there is one thing I would want anyone to take from everything I've told you tonight, it is this. When someone you love tells a story about your life that isn't true, the answer is almost never a louder story told back at them. The answer is patience and evidence, and the quiet, unglamorous discipline of simply continuing to be who you actually are, in full view, for as long as it takes. I was not the reason my marriage failed. I was, for a while, simply the only person in the room who knew that, and I want anyone listening to this who is carrying a similar quiet knowledge right now to understand that knowing the truth is not nothing, even when you're the only one who knows it yet. Keep the truth. Keep it dated, keep it documented if you need to, and above all, keep being who you actually are, because that in the end is the only story that ever really holds up under everyone else's scrutiny, including your own. I think, in the end of Ashford Falls itself, this small river town where I have now lived my entire adult life, and how strange it is to have lived out something this private, in a place small enough that almost everyone eventually hears almost everything about everyone else, one way or another. I used to think that was a curse about small towns, the slow, inevitable leak of every private fact into common knowledge, and in some ways, during the worst of this, it felt exactly like that. A curse, watching a false version of my life circulate through people I saw at the grocery store, and the kids' school functions before the true version had a chance to catch up. But I think differently about it now, 3.5 years on, because the same slow, porous quality that let the false story spread in those first weeks is the same quality that eventually let the true story spread too, through Susan and Carol and Marcus in a lumber aisle, and Camille over coffee, and Marjorie at a housewarming patiently, person by person, until the town's understanding of what actually happened finally caught up to the facts. Small towns do not keep secrets forever. They just take their time getting to the truth, and I have learned to trust that slow, communal correction instead of fearing it, because in the end, it corrected itself in exactly the direction the facts pointed, the way I have to believe it usually does, given enough time and enough people willing to actually pay attention. Thank you for listening to my story tonight. If it meant something to you, if any piece of it reminded you of your own life or someone you love, I would ask you to do one simple thing before you go, which is to subscribe to this channel, because we share stories exactly like this one, true accounts of ordinary people who lived through extraordinary betrayals and found their way to the other side of them every single day. And if you want to be there when the next one goes up, subscribing is the only way to make sure you don't miss it. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and tell me if you're comfortable sharing it, whether you have ever had to fight to reclaim your own story from someone who tried to rewrite it, because I read every single comment, and I promise you, you are far from the only person who has lived through something like this. If this story moved you, give it a like before you go. It helps more than you know in getting these stories in front of the people who need to hear them, and share it with anyone in your life who might need to hear tonight. Specifically, that the truth is patient and it's stronger than any story told against it, and it is always, eventually, worth the wait. Until the next story, take care of yourselves, and take care of the truth, because some days, it is the only thing standing quietly on your side. One last thing, before I go. If you are sitting somewhere right now, with your own version of a locked phone, or a friend's quiet warning you have not wanted to fully hear yet, or a story someone you love has already started telling about you, before you've said a single word in your own defense, I want you to know that you are allowed to move slowly. You're allowed to gather the truth carefully instead of reacting to your fear of it loudly. You're allowed to grieve the good years even while you're gathering evidence about the bad ones, because both of those things were real, and neither one cancels the other out. And whatever you eventually decide, whether that is staying or leaving, forgiving or not forgiving, telling your whole family or telling no one at all, I want you to know that the calm, patient version of yourself capable of getting through something like this already exists inside you, the same way it existed inside me long before I ever needed to find it, sitting in a car outside a party, or a home office at 3 a.m, or a kitchen table across from someone you once promised the rest of your life to. You do not have to be loud to be believed. You only have to be true and patient and willing to let the truth do the slow, steady work it is always eventually going to do. That is the whole of what I wanted to leave you with tonight, and I am grateful, more than I can easily say, that you stayed to hear all of it.